One of the most beloved Orthodox rabbis in Israel several years ago made a public statement that has turned into a firestorm that has geopolitical and prophetic implications. Welcome to Skywatch TV. I'm Derek Gilbert. We're beginning a series of programs about the most contested 35 acres of real estate on planet Earth, the Temple Mount. Joining me on the panel, the CEO of Skywatch TV, best-selling author of such books as Petrus Romanus, Exo Vaticana, The Final Roman Emperor, and his brand new book, The Rabbis, Donald Trump, and the Secret Plan to Build the Third Temple, Dr. Thomas Horn.
Great to be here.
The author of a book that reads like an exciting movie, like a National Treasure or Indiana Jones type film, the Copper Scroll Project. We welcome Shelley Neese to the program for the first time.
Thanks for having me.
And the author of such best-selling books as Gods and Thrones, The Gods of Ground Zero, and his brand new book, and the focus of our conversation today, The Rabbi, The Secret Message, and the Identity of Messiah. We welcome Pastor Carl Gallups back to Skywatch TV.
Thank you, Derek. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Rabbi Kaduri, how popular was he, and why was his revelation, his disclosure that that the name of Messiah, the identity of Messiah had been revealed to him? Why is that such a big deal?
Okay, good. Well, thanks for asking me. And I'll give the quick, short, long and short of it version, okay?
And I guess we should point out first of all that you were the author of the book, The Rabbi Who Found Messiah. So
yes.
This sort of follows up on that.
And to this day, when I wrote it, it was the first book ever, official book and published and written on this story, which is a true story, of course. And to this day remains so after all of these years. And now this new book I have coming out is a complete revisiting of it. There's so much more that's happened. Witnesses have come forward. Some amazing supernatural things have happened, and so that the book tells all of that. It's like reading a novel, if you will. But in the meantime, let me just answer your two questions. You asked first about why was he so popular? Who was he to be so popular? And what was it that he did that rocked the world? Okay, so here's my quick answers to those. And the reason I say that is because the story is very complex. It's very intricate, easy to understand once you connect the dots. When I say complex, I don't want people to think that it's not understandable. It is. But there's a lot of backstory to it, which is why we wrote this new book.
Sure.
Just a lot of backstory and a lot of new things. But the bottom line is, here's the deal. He passed away in 2006, but in the year that he passed away, he was 108 years old. And he had been living in what would later become the revenant nation of Israel, but he had been living in that land since he was in his 20s, having come out of and escaped out of Iraq and came there into that land, hoping along with many others that eventually that God would allow it to be Israel again.
So 20 years before Israel became a nation, Rabbi Kaduri was there.
Okay. So, but anyway, by the time he passes away in 2006, he is the most venerated rabbi in modern Israel's history, perhaps ever in history. On the day of his funeral, there were over 300,000 people. They closed the streets of Jerusalem for 2 days. People flew in. Ben Gurion Airport was crammed with people from all over the world. The president of Israel gave the eulogy. All manner of the most famous rabbis were there speaking and praying. It was amazing. That's how popular. He was deeply connected to prime ministers, Ariel Sharon, Benjamin Netanyahu. As a matter of fact, he was responsible for, and this is heavily documented in secular sources, documented again in my book, was very responsible for Benjamin Netanyahu's first time as prime minister. I mean, he swayed the votes at the last, and they all admitted it. So this is how popular, and this is why he was so popular. He was a Kabbalist, which is really huge in the Orthodox movement. And so people came to him from all over for prayers and amulets and good luck charms and all of these things. But the bottom line is that's why he was so popular, because of all of those connections, the spiritual connections, the nationalistic connections, the Zionistic connections, the political connections. But what rocked the world was because when you take a guy of this stature, what the people at that funeral didn't know that day, but his synagogue congregants knew, and some of the students in his yeshiva, and most of your audience knows that the term yeshiva, it translates loosely to seminary or a rabbinical training school. But in his yeshiva, some of his students, a select group of his students, he had been revealing this excuse me for the redundancy, this revelation that he had said that he had been given from God to a select group of students. And then he told his synagogue congregation just a few months before he passed, and he wouldn't have known at the time he gave it that it would just be a couple months later that he would pass. But he told his synagogue congregation, I have met Messiah. I know who the real Messiah is. I've met him in a vision. I know his name. I will reveal his name. I will reveal the details of it, but I'm putting it in a note. It's being turned over to my ministry officials. And you got to understand, this guy was the Billy Graham of Jews in Israel. I mean, forgive me for using that. I mean,
That's good.
The Jewish people might be offended by that because, Billy Graham's an evangelical
Trying to relate
Christian.
one to the other.
I'm just
For us
trying to
Christians,
relate. That's
yeah.
right, yeah. So, but in other words, he was at that level where Billy Graham to evangelicals across the world and in America, you see Billy Graham's face, you know who it is if it's on a cover of a book. You just know, you know it. Yitzhak Kaduri is the same way in the Orthodox Jewish movement. And so he said, I know who it is. I've had this vision. And the people in the synagogue were like, oh my gosh. And he says, I'm going to write the name down. I'm going to put a note, turn it over to my ministry officials. Oh, they had a website. I mean, it was huge. Millions of followers all over the world. They were really into the technology. 108 years old. His son that runs it was 80-something years old when his dad passed. And then he ran the ministry. Again, like Billy Graham and his son. You see the similarities there. So the bottom line is, that he says to his congregation, he says, now I've written in a note, I've given it, it's under lock and seal to my ministry officials. They've not read it, they don't know anything about it, but they don't know what it reveals. But 1 year after my death, I want it posted on the website. Now, the 1 year waiting period is a Jewish thing. It's an Orthodox Jewish thing, so that you don't disrespect the name of the person that's deceased. And I write about this in my book. But the bottom line is, so a couple months later, he passes. Well, in January 2006, he passed. October 2005 is when he told his synagogue this. So 1 year later, January 2007, the note was posted. Now, I'm just going to get to the point of it. It was written kind of cryptically, and this is how a Kabbalist would do it, but he left the code for decoding it. But even that was cryptic. So when the note was put on his website, it didn't reveal the name of Messiah. It mentioned concerning the abbreviation of his name. So it mentioned the name, but then it just went on to say, he shall lift his people and prove that the word and law are valid. Well, that's just a generic Orthodox Jewish statement about Messiah. When he comes, he will lift his people and prove that the word is valid. But his followers were saying, wait, he stood right in front of us and said he's going to give us the name. And then after a few weeks, some of his students who knew what he knew, because he had been teaching them secretly, they started looking at it, and they looked at that first sentence. It says, concerning the letter abbreviation of his name, comma, he shall lift his people and prove that the word and law are valid. Now, he shall lift his people and prove that the word and law are valid. That's a lot of words in English, but that sentence structure is comprised by 6 Hebrew words, phrases. It's like, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, in English, that's 10 words. In Hebrew, it's 7. Okay, so it's the same. His note was similar to that. They got to looking at it, and they said, concerning the letter abbreviation of his name, and then they looked at what was left, and it was just 6 words. And so they took the first letter of each of the 6 words, and it was Yehoshua, or Yeshua. And they said, oh my gosh, he said Jesus is Messiah. And of course, the Jewish world went crazy, the Orthodox Jewish world, the Christian world was like, they were a little skeptical, like, really? That can't be. I mean, because that would be like Billy Graham leaving a note that says that Allah is the true God.
Right.
I mean, as far as the mindset of this. So anyway, that's the note that shook the world and is still shaking it. And there's a huge backstory to it now, a lot of supernatural stuff, a lot of witnesses have come forward. The note was destroyed in a ritualistic, occultic manner on purpose. All of that's in the book. And so that's believe me, that's the short story.
So the never before told backstory, all included in part of the book here.
Yes.
You mentioned the pushback from the Jewish world. A very influential rabbi named Tovia Singer is claiming that this whole thing is false.
Yes.
What are his arguments and how do you respond?
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I deal with this in the book. Listen, I'm very gracious to people. I mean, I try to present both sides of the story. So the book doesn't trash or attack Rabbi Singer, but I mean, he's on record as saying, this is all fake, and here's why, and here's why. So I just take his points of argument and I examine them with facts, and I back it up with tons of scholarly attestations, and it's not just pulling the stuff out of my back pocket. I just show there's a huge cover-up. Listen, the book says by Carl Gallups, and it is, but it says underneath with Messianic Rabbi Zev Porat.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and the reason is, and this answers your question, is because I met Messianic Rabbi Zev Porat, who was born and raised in Israel, went through all the rabbinical training schools. His father was a rabbi, his grandfather was a rabbi, his great-grandfather a rabbi. In fact, his grandfather was on the Dayan, which is the Orthodox rabbinical courts. He was a judge. Very influential people. On his mother's side, a lot of those people are bigwigs in the Israeli government. In very high positions. And so he's deeply connected. He speaks Hebrew as his first language, but in the meantime, he's a born-again believer now. So when I wrote the first book, I had some things in there about him because he was aware of all this, and he was on YouTube ministering to some of the students, and their testimonies were, yes, he was teaching us in the yeshiva that Jesus is Messiah secretly. That's why we knew what the note said, etc. Wow. So all of that. Well, so Zev now is just chapter after chapter after chapter. He's quoted in this book. I mean, he gives his testimony, how he got connected. This goes to Tovia, Rabbi Singer. And so the bottom line is, when Zev got involved, being an insider, the Yad Lakim, it's an anti-missionary group. It's kind of like our ACLU. That's just anti-everything. Okay, well, they've got something like that in Israel, Yad Lakim. And Rabbi Singer is deeply connected to Yad Lakim. But the deal is, when this story came out, it was devastating to the Orthodox Jewish movement. And they said, well, he couldn't have said this. He would never have said this, just like Billy Graham would never say Allah is the... Okay. So Singer came out, Rabbi Singer came out as kind of an apologist, an apologist for the Orthodox movement, and his mission, apparently, and part of his mission, he had a big live radio program. He had access to a lot of media, so he was a huge voice. And one of his missions was to kind of back Yad Lakim's play to put down Zev Porat, who was living there, interviewing, students and putting them on the internet, and they were testifying. And these guys are 50, 60 years old. They're rabbis, and they're saying, yes, this is not a lie. This is not fake. That's what he was teaching us. And so Rabbi Singer came out and he said, well, and his first argument was, Yehoshua is the letters, but that's not Yeshua. And Yehoshua and Yeshua, two different words totally. They don't even mean the same thing. He wasn't even talking about Jesus. Well, that's just not so. And I do a deep scholarly layout of that, what the Hebrew scholars say about that from way back, hundreds of years ago, what they were writing about that name. And Zev, he attests to it. So that was one of the things he says. I can't remember. There are several other things that Rabbi Singer said, and we show. He said that he went and talked to people in the family, and they didn't know anything about the note. Well, but that's not true, because he stood before his whole congregation, his whole family's there. His own son, who ran the ministry, was interviewed by I think it was Israel Today. Yes, it was. Interviewed by Israel Today, admitting that they had the note, they put it on the website, and that he was saying, but I don't know, this has got to be a fake somehow, because my father would never do. But then Singer's out there saying a couple of years later, well, I talked to people, family, they knew nothing about the note. So it's just so much obfuscation. And that's one example of what we're up against here. There's a fake news deep state attempt in Israel, and Zev Porat talks about it. He said our fake news and deep state is deeper than in the United States. He said, especially when it comes to stuff like this, they will cover it up, they will bury it, they will lie about it, they will obfuscate, they will twist the truth and twist the facts, and so I uncover all of that in this book. I'm telling you, it's a fascinating read because it reads like a novel.
Like a detective story, which
Yes.
is, appropriate given Carl's law enforcement background.
Yeah.
We're going to tell you more about the book and then tie this into the Third Temple and the political machinations over the Third Temple as our conversation with Carl Gallups, Shelley Neese, and Tom Horn about their books. And again, the focus this week on the new book by Carl Gallups, The Rabbi, The Secret Message, and the Identity of Messiah, when Skywatch TV continues after this. Welcome back to Skywatch TV. I'm Derek Gilbert. Please take advantage of our free mobile app because these programs can be downloaded directly to your smartphone or tablet wherever you are on planet Earth. As long as you've got an internet connection or data for your phone, whether it's Android, iOS, Windows Phone, Amazon Kindle Fire tablets, the mobile app works for all of those. Not only these broadcast programs, but exclusive programs that we can't get on network television, daily news updates, and weekly programs that look at the world of science through a biblical lens, Into the Multiverse, Chalk Talk, Sci Friday, all of those with the free Skywatch TV mobile app. You'll find information about it at skywatchtv.com. Joining me on the panel today as we talk about the Temple Mount and specifically issues related to the stress, the tension, the geopolitical maneuvering around the Temple Mount. Shelley Neese, author of the brand new book, The Copper Scroll Project. Tom Horn, author of the new book, The Rabbis, Donald Trump, and the Secret Plan to Build the Third Temple. And Pastor Carl Gallups, who, along with Rabbi Zev Porat, has authored the new book, The Rabbi, The Secret Message, and the Identity of Messiah. The Temple Mount. Carl, how does this question over what Rabbi Kaduri said regarding the identity of Messiah fit into what the political tensions over the Temple Mount?
Well, it's multifaceted, but let me just again get to the bottom line, most interesting part of this story. Several years prior to Rabbi Kaduri even revealing publicly that he had had a vision of the true Messiah, and by the way, Jews and Muslims all over the world are having Jesus visions and dreams, and this is so richly documented. So I think Rabbi Kaduri was probably one of those that, I mean, it would be like when God reached down to the Apostle Paul. You know, he was a prominent figure that he put his hand on, gave him the vision of the risen Christ. Jesus appeared to him. Next thing you know, he's writing half of the New Testament documents and turning the world upside down for Jesus Christ. I think God, I'm not trying to say Rabbi Kaduri is equivalent to the Apostle Paul, but it was a similar kind of thing. That's why he chose him. So several years prior, though, to his revelation to the world about Jesus being the real Messiah, he was publicly acknowledged in mainstream Israeli press, and I've got all this documented. None of this that I'm saying is being pulled out of my back pocket. It's all heavily documented in my book. But he is on record as calling Jews from all over the world, please return to Israel. Now watch. This probably went over a lot of people's heads at first when he said it, now that we know what we know has happened in our lifetime. But he was saying, come to Israel, come back to Israel. Things are shaking. These are his words. The world is shaking. Something's getting ready to happen. And then he said, we need you to come back so that we can rebuild the third temple. Now watch. When he wrote that, Jerusalem was not the official, legal, recognized capital, which that had to happen in order for anybody to seriously consider doing anything with a temple on the Temple Mount. Don't know if or when all of that will happen, but now people are talking about it as though we're on the edge of it, the possibility. But he was saying this years ago, you got to come back. It's getting ready to happen. Something's shaking. God has revealed to me. And I'm not making him out to be the prophet of prophets. I'm just telling you what he said, and it's all documented. And again, in my book. And he was saying, because the Temple Mount is important. The temple needs to be rebuilt. It will be rebuilt, and you need to come back. And calling Jews from everywhere. Well, Jews have been coming, and from everywhere, and they've just recently passed the threshold of being more Jews living in Israel now than in any other singular nation of the world, including the United States. It just happened last year. According to the Statistics Bureau of the Israeli government that keeps track of those things, and that was in secular news. So he said that. Now, when you think about the fact that he would say that in a time when it would have been thought impossible, and they thought, well, he's just a crazy old man. Why would he be building a temple? That'll never happen on the Temple Mount. I mean, people were thinking that years ago. But then he comes right up to his point of passing when he reveals, I've had a vision. I know who the real Messiah is. His name is Yeshua, or Yehoshua, Jesus. And then Yad Lakim jumps in this big controversy and the world blows up. I write the book. People are going crazy. People love it or hate it. And nobody's in the middle. And now it's getting deeper and deeper and deeper, which is why I had to write the second book. Zev Porat's involved. More and more people are involved. More things are coming out. And lo and behold, a man who's never been on a school committee, never been a dog catcher, nothing wrong with school committees and dog catchers. I'm just saying a man named Donald Trump, who's been a lot of things. I mean, he's a TV star and a multi-billionaire, but he's never been a politician, becomes the most powerful person the planet to date has ever seen. And what I mean by that is he's the president of the United States, the number one hyperpower of the world, the number one economy of the world, and he's the head of it. And he's never even served on a PTA. You understand what I'm saying? And now he's there, and what does he do within his first year, at the end of his first year in office? He signs the law that hands Jerusalem back to Israel and makes the statement that this had to be done. This was the only thing we could do. It was the right thing to do. A few days later, the OIC meets, the Organization of Islamic Council, 57 Muslim nations going out of their minds. A few days later, the United Nations meets, 120 nations condemn it. The whole world comes unglued at the seams. Donald Trump basically said, I don't care. Benjamin Netanyahu said, we don't care. The Knesset passes a law. Yes, it's ours. Now what's everybody talking about? Now we can build a temple. What did Kaduri say a few years ago? Something's shaking. Something's getting ready to happen. Something the world will never believe. And I'm calling Jews to come be a part of this. Come be a part of this, because something's getting ready to happen and we're going to rebuild the temple. Now, he had to, if that truly was a vision from God there, and I don't know what happened in his head. He said that. He could have just made it up, but he said it, and it's on record years ago. So if it was a vision from God, he had to have seen or foreseen the return of Jerusalem, which is a prophetic event. He had to have foreseen that would set up this whole thing. And then he had to have known when God says to him, now I'm going to show you who the real Messiah is. And when he has a vision of Jesus himself, he claims to have spoken to him and his name, and he leaves it. Thus, in the eyes of Orthodox Jews, destroying his entire heritage of Orthodox ministry.
And so many other things have also transpired. Recently, the red heifer. Certified by the Sanhedrin as being perfect, to the point that the ashes could now be served for ritual purification, which is one of the things that would have kept them from being able to conduct services inside of the third temple. So over the next few weeks, we'll keep talking about all these things, but the dominoes are falling towards, I think, a historic moment.
They really are. That's the point. So that's how it's all interconnected. And as I said, we've just scratched the surface. There's so many more things the book reveals. And
Absolutely.
I think people are going to, that care anything about this story at all, are going to really love this.
Well, this is why Carl Gallups has been saying for quite some time now, we're living in the most prophetic times since the first century. And what a time to be alive, as our friend Dr. Michael Lake says. Just imagine the apostles and the prophets leaning over the rails of heaven, cheering those of us who are living in these days as we get close to that finish line. The books that we'll be talking about for the next several weeks: The Copper Scroll Project by Shelley Neese, The Rabbis, Donald Trump, and the Top Secret Plan to Build the Third Temple by Tom Horn, and the book that was the focus of our conversation today, The Rabbi, The Secret Message, and The Identity of Messiah, Pastor Carl Gallups with Rabbi Zev Porat. We thank you for watching as we keep watch. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is Skywatch TV.
Millions of people from around the globe were stunned when U.S. President Donald Trump shocked the world by recognizing Jerusalem as the eternal capital of Israel and ordering the American embassy to be moved there.
The United States finally and officially recognized Jerusalem as the true capital of Israel and opened our embassy in the historic and sacred land of Jerusalem.
Over 2,000 years have elapsed since Jesus Christ warned of a day when a man of sin, the Antichrist, would appear to lead the world into deception and destruction.
Even Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu admits that biblical prophecies are unfolding, that Donald Trump is a King Cyrus-like figure leading the world into a new era of man.
President Trump, by recognizing history, you have made history. The Temple Mount is in our hands.
Violent protests continued in the Middle East today over President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital.
And now the official Sanhedrin in Israel declared President Trump is advancing a prophetic process that will usher in, when the time comes, the rebuilding of the Third Temple.
As the world awaits, a secret, incendiary scheme is underway by religious authorities, government agents, and Jewish rabbis to build a third temple.
When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in that holy place, then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be again.
The rabbis, Donald Trump, and the top secret plan to build the third temple.
The most contested piece of real estate on the planet is a little spot of about 35 acres on a low hill in Jerusalem. That's the focus of our conversation here. We're in the middle of a series here on Skywatch TV about the Temple Mount and several new books that deal with the Temple Mount and the plan to bring forth the third temple. Welcome to Skywatch TV. I'm Derek Gilbert. Joining me, the authors of these new books under discussion. First, the CEO of Skywatch TV, author of such best-selling books as Petrus Romanus, Exo Vaticana, The Final Roman Emperor, and his new book, The Rabbis, Donald Trump, and the Secret Plan to Build the Third Temple, Dr. Thomas Horn.
Good to be here.
The best-selling author of Gods of Ground Zero, Gods and Thrones, and the new book, The Rabbi, The Secret Message, and the Identity of Messiah, Pastor Carl Gallups.
Thank you.
And the focus today is an author who is vice president of the Jerusalem Connection International. She's got a master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies from Ben Gurion University in the Negev. And her book, which reads like something you'd see on the big screen starring Harrison Ford, The Copper Scroll, An Ancient Secret Fuels the Battle for the Temple Mount. We welcome Shelley Neese to the program for the first time. Shelley, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Derek. I prefer Laura Croft from Tomb Raider.
There you go.
if we're casting right now.
Make a note.
You're
right. The Copper Scroll. This almost sounds so fantastic. This discovery among the Dead Sea Scrolls. It almost sounds like something made up. What is the Copper Scroll?
Right. Well, so I think one of the biggest questions that people have, especially people that are believers and have had a long faith journey themselves, they think, well, the Copper Scroll couldn't possibly be real because I haven't heard of it.
Exactly.
You know? And I had that first attitude as well. I was studying in Israel. I had been to visit the Dead Sea Scrolls many times. And so when I first heard about the Copper Scroll, I thought, if this was real, then I would have heard of it. So it sets off everyone's suspicion radar.
It sounds too fantastic to be real.
Right. So if you have any piece of cynicism in you, it will be set off immediately. Except for all you have to do is, Wikipedia, Copper Scroll, go to any scholarly resource, and it'll all just say the same thing over and over, whether or not it's from a biblical minimalist perspective or biblical maximalist. They all will say the same thing. It's a 2,000-year-old treasure map. There's no getting around that definition.
Wow.
So the main thing is that the Copper Scroll is part of the Dead Sea Scroll collection. It was found in Cave 3, so there was 11 different caves, or now we know there was 12 caves actually. And it was found by archaeologists, so it wasn't even found by Bedouin. In fact, the story is really unusual because it was found by a French archaeologist leading a team, and it was in Cave 3, the head was the Jordanian Department of Antiquities. They were sponsoring this excavation. But they had been excavating this cave for 10 days, and it was only in the last couple of hours, on the last day of excavation, as they were wrapping it up. And it was a bit of a disappointing excavation because they could tell that Cave 3 once had just a trove of Dead Sea Scrolls, but the ceiling had collapsed in antiquity. So all of the scroll jars, those Dead Sea Scroll jars that we're used to seeing, they had crushed. And so really it left the scrolls just exposed to the elements. And so they could see scroll fragments in rodent nest in the cave, and they could see that it was once a really robust library, but for the most part, it was a disappointing cave. And so what had happened, though, is on the last day, in the last few hours, they see that it almost like a false wall, that there had been, from whether or not it was from when the ceiling had collapsed in the cave in antiquity or at what point that happened, but they realized that there was a hollow part behind this one back, almost like a cave within the cave, or a secret room in a castle's chamber. And so they chipped through, and they see resting on a man-made shelf 2 rolls of copper, just like the Statue of Liberty. They were oxidized, beautiful green patina. And so they carefully handled them. And this didn't look like any other Dead Sea Scroll that had previously been found. It was really unusual because it was carefully placed. There had been some thoughts about the Dead Sea Scrolls before then, that maybe they were hastily thrown in the caves on the run. What was this, a Jerusalem library that had been deposited by Jews fleeing and thought they would come back and retrieve them? But the copper scroll was different because it looked hidden. It had clearly been put there on purpose. But the problem is when they pull these scrolls out, all the other Dead Sea Scrolls are parchment or leather. There's no other thing like this ever found in antiquity.
Yeah.
And so it crumbled at the slightest touch. So in some ways, what happens with copper is that green patina protects it. And so it was like a natural preservative for this scroll. But after 2,000 years trying to unroll a copper scroll, it took them 3 years. It sat in the museum in Jordan, in Amman, Jordan. And for 3 years, they didn't know how to open it. I will say that had this been the only antiquity they were dealing with, they probably would have been able to give it proper focus. But these are the years that the market is being flooded with Dead Sea Scrolls every day. So they're having thousands of fragments flood in, and they're dealing with those. So it probably wasn't getting the proper attention that it would have got if it had been the only antiquity found in that moment in time. However, there was one person on the editorial team, his name was John Allegro, and he really championed the copper scroll. And no doubt you can understand why, because when you look at the copper scroll, even when it was rolled up, they could see words like gold, silver, dig, vessels. So the words that they could see protruding from the outside of the scroll were enough to intrigue.
Yeah.
And he approached Johns Hopkins University. He approached different metallurgists and experts in antiquities in this kind of field, and no one wanted to take the responsibility, because what if we never knew what was on the inside. We never knew what the contents of the copper scroll were, and it shattered. And so he took it to Manchester University in London. And just by God's sort of divine chain of events, he found this man named Henry Wright Baker. Now, Henry Wright Baker was not an expert on antiquities. He wasn't an archaeologist. He was in the College of Engineering at Manchester University, but he was a believer, and he had faith, and he had guts. And so he said, I'll try it. I'll give it a try. He made this very crude contraption that I doubt would have passed any muster today, but he used old retired British materials from World War II. He borrowed things from the School of Dentistry, and he basically made a spindle that would make slight cuts in the copper scroll to open it and expose it, and it would blow away the dust and things that had accrued inside of it, and it had a vacuum, and it would jump on the table while he was doing it. I mean, really kind of a nightmare situation. But John Allegro, he was sort of the keeper of the copper scroll. He was on the Dead Sea Scroll team, and he said, okay, after they made the contraption, he said, I'll meet you back here in the morning, and we'll make the first cut, and we'll see what happens. And Henry Wright Baker said, okay, and they agreed to meet in the morning. In fact, he had no plans to wait till the morning. He made the first cut that night, and he writes in his diary, if he had shattered this 2,000-year-old document, he wanted to be alone in his misery. So by the time John Allegro comes back the next morning, the copper scroll is open. Eventually, It's cut into 23 pieces, and we can read it. And what they found out was that this is 12 columns, over 60 locations of buried treasure.
Wow.
The Hebrew dated to, it's 2,000 years old. And so when they were reading it, and really Hebrew's an unusual language in that a second grader in Israel today can look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, can look at the copper scroll and be able to make it out, be able to read it like we would with Old English, with the Shakespearean play. Right. And so everyone, all Israelis, can look at this copper scroll and it reads like a verbal treasure map. One item after another, it'll tell you where to go, how deep to dig, and what you'll find when you do. Amazing. It's really sort of a dry inventory. It doesn't give any backstory. It doesn't say these are the people who hid it here. It doesn't bring you into any kind of narrative description, which for scholars is one thing that proves its authenticity, because this isn't a story that that is being introduced by Jeremiah. They're not claiming any certain authorship. It is a very dry, boring inventory of treasure, where you can find it, and what you'll find when you do.
So well, let me speed this up here, because sadly we can only do so much in the span of half an hour. Jim Barfield is kind of championing the search for some of these treasures. Who is Jim Barfield, and how has he applied his background? I guess, what is his background? How has he applied that to trying to figure out where these treasures are?
Right. So what's amazing to me is that the Copper Scroll was found in 1952, and that all of this time there really have been very few people who have gone in search of the Copper Scroll
Which
treasure.
is a little surprising.
To me, it is, because to me, once you know about the Copper Scroll, how can you ever get it out of your head?
Well, yeah, I mean,
You can't unsee it.
treasures from the time of Jesus, right?
Exactly. So that was always surprising to me, that there haven't been more people that have gone in search of its promise. However, when you think about it, it is occupying this strange space in terms of, this isn't classic archaeology, because classic archaeology will dig down to the last level of habitation.
Right.
You know, if it goes into a site, they want to see, how did people live there? What are the artifacts that they left behind? This is treasure hunting, because the Copper Scroll says, hey, not only go down to the last level of habitation, but also go 9 feet under that. Dig a probe 9 feet under that, and that's where you'll find this buried treasure. So it's treasure hunting. So that's one thing, is that a classical archaeologist would not have approached the Copper Scroll with a mind to find these items.
This is almost like the Hollywood version of archaeology.
Right.
Laura Croft.
And it would also, they're very worried about their own reputations and what it looks like that they're doing. And that applies all over it with Israeli archaeology, because it's biblical archaeology. So some archaeologists use the Bible in terms of what they're looking for and how to inform the digs that they're conducting. And then some Israeli archaeologists or biblical archaeologists don't want to be seen, within 10 feet of a Bible. And so the Copper Scroll fits in that space. And so it really took someone like Jim Barfield, who comes at it, he's self-educated, Oklahoma man, arson investigator, but he had a passion for the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, like all of us, just that this was an opportunity to read the Bible, and it's, the oldest form of the Bible by 1,000 years, by 2,000 years, really. And so he at first was fascinated with the Dead Sea Scrolls. There was a man named Vendel Jones who spent most of his lifetime searching for Copper Scroll treasure. And so they had a conversation one night. They were acquaintances. And really, Jim Barfield had never been interested in the Copper Scroll, because for believers, we're interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls that are connected to the Bible, that give commentary on the Bible. And the Copper Scroll doesn't do that. If you're looking to the Copper Scroll to sort of inform your biblical knowledge, it really won't help you on the surface. And what Vendel Jones encouraged Jim Barfield to do, Vendel Jones was getting to the end of his career at that point, and he just encouraged him to look at the Copper Scroll with new eyes, to look at it. And according to Vendel Jones, and he, has been living and breathing Copper Scroll for most of his life, but he felt like the Copper Scroll actually reveals more about the Bible and the time that it was written and the time that this gift was given to us, more than any of the other Dead Sea Scrolls. And so that's what Jim Barfield did. He's the kind of guy that happens to have a aerial map of Qumran in his office one morning when he starts studying the Dead Sea Scroll. And he says he did something that was different than what anybody else had done when they read, including Vendel Jones. When he reads the Copper Scroll starts out in the Valley of Achor under the ruins. And so most people have looked at that very first line and thought that applies to location 1. And second line applies to location 2, and on and on and on. And what he did is he saw that as a preamble. He saw it as, all of the items are buried in the Valley of Achor under the ruins. So what ruins? Where is the Valley of Achor? And can I find architectural matches for everything that follows in the Copper Scroll thereafter? Because the Copper Scroll is just, it's one reason why people have had a hard time figuring out is because it's very specific to the time and place that it was written. So it'll say things that are unfamiliar to us from the Bible. It'll say things like Mattia's courtyard, or the Great Cistern, or the double entry mikveh, or just these things that how in the world, where in Israel would they be now? How can we know? And so he was able to look at the Copper Scroll, and Qumran is a ruin in the Valley of Achor. So we started there because the Copper Scroll, Cave 3, and all of the Dead Sea Scrolls were written at Qumran were found around Qumran, so why not start there? And what he found out over the course of a few years is that you can make a perfect fingerprint match for every architectural description in the Copper Scroll with a different point of the Qumran ruins.
We're going to talk more about this and find out why, how far Jim Barfield's gotten in searching for these treasures, what has stopped the treasure hunt, and how does this connect to the third temple, the Temple Mount? We're talking about the Copper Scroll. Shelley Neese is the author. Pastor Carl Gallups and Tom Horn join me on the panel, and our conversation continues right after this. Welcome back to Skywatch TV. I'm Derek Gilbert. Joining me as we continue our discussion on the Temple Mount, the third temple, and various aspects related to the political struggles over the Temple Mount. Dr. Tom Horn, author of the new book, The Rabbis, Donald Trump, and the Secret Plan to Build the Third Temple. Pastor Carl Gallups, author of the new book, The Rabbi, the Secret Message and the Identity of Messiah, and the subject of this week's book, The Copper Scroll, an ancient secret fuels the battle for the Temple Mount. Shelley Neese is the author. Jim Barfield, how far has he gotten in searching for the treasures described on the Copper Scroll? And again, how does this relate to the Temple Mount, the third temple?
Right. Well, so like Carl, the backstory is really intense, and it's all in the book. But I'll speed you up to the point that through really a series of sort of divine events, Jim Barfield, this arson investigator in Oklahoma who knows no one in Israel, who has no idea, once he thinks that he's found out how to solve the Copper Scroll, he has no idea how to present that information to the Israel Antiquities Authority, but he is able to get a meeting almost immediately through sort of a crazy chain of events that all are related to Apache Indians in Oklahoma. It's really amazing.
Almost like God had his hand in it.
Yeah. Right.
Almost like that.
It can be the only answer, and so that part of the story is very fun, but he gets a meeting with the Israel Antiquities Authority, and at that point, it's almost a favor. The Israel Antiquities Authority is sort of paying a favor to a friend, and they're meeting with Jim Barfield in the city of Jerusalem. And Jim knows that. He feels that in the very first meeting, but he starts to present the research. He was an arson investigator. He was an internationally recognized, award-winning arson investigator. So he plays that humble card a lot, but he's good. He's good at what he does. And he teaches report writing at the Comanche College in Oklahoma. So he has this 267-page report at this point, just identifying every location of the Copper Scroll with aerial maps, with graphic design. And so really, I mean, and he walks the head of the Israel Antiquities Authority, Shuka Dorfman at the time, he's since passed away. He walks them through the first 5 locations. I speak Hebrew. I lived in Israel for a time. And so he has an audio recorder in his pocket during the meeting. And so I've since listened to the recording. And you hear Shuka Dorfman stop him and say, I need to make a phone call. And on the phone call, he calls the head of Qumran at the time. It was Yuval Peleg and Yitzhak Magen. Yuval Peleg has since also passed away in a tragic cave collapse accident. But he calls him and he says, I think he's done it. And so in that course of really a year, fast forward from that moment till we are breaking ground at Qumran, Yuval Peleg is leading the dig. He was the number 2 in charge of Qumran at the time. And we're able to excavate or probe 5 sites at Qumran. The problem is that there are 60 plus locations in the Copper Scroll, all of them that we think are targeted and at Qumran. Qumran itself is a sacred site because it's associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is a very important site to Israelis.
Sure.
And we're having to dig depths, 3 feet just to get to where the Copper Scroll writers started, and then another 9 feet to where they're directing us. And Jim Barfield has targeted different locations at Qumran, but we still need to dig at a certain depth and at a certain breadth. And so it became obvious during that time that we needed technology, that we needed a metal detector to be able to make more targeted pinpoints, and that if we probed 60 locations in Qumran, it would end up looking like a close-up shot of the moon by the time we were done. And
I was thinking same illustration. Looked like a moonscape.
We couldn't do it, you know. So we got to a point that it became clear that we either needed to wait out the technology, or that, because also not only would it be a lot of probes, some of these sites like the double entry mikvahs and things are very, they're plastered. So you would also have to break plaster. You would have to break parts of the ruins. And so really we came up to a point that we had to wait out the technology.
So now, how does this relate to the Temple Mount? I mean, Qumran is considerably south of Jerusalem. We drove past it on our way to Masada during our tour of Israel back in May. Sadly, we didn't stop. All we did was just kind of wave at the caves as we drove past. But,
right.
Again, there's some distance from Qumran to Jerusalem in the Temple Mount. How do they connect?
Right. Well, so one thing about the Temple Mount movement is that there is something happening in Israel right now, Temple Mount denial. So whether or not it makes any sense to us, but part of the Palestinian narrative is that there was never a Jerusalem temple, that there was never a Jewish temple on the Temple Mount.
Right.
No scholar would agree with that. No sane thinking person would agree with that. But that is a narrative that has to be fought. The problem is that one of the things that Temple Mount deniers use is the fact, and it is true, that there's never been anything found from the interior of the first or the second temple. Now, there's reasons for that. There's loads found. You know, we still have the retaining walls from the Jewish temple. We still have tons of historical records outside of the Bible about the second temple. So these aren't really points of denial that make sense, but it's true in terms of the ritual vessels, in terms of, I mean, Solomon's temple, you know,
Nebuchadnezzar carried that off.
Right.
But yeah, and so and we're not allowed to excavate on the Temple Mount, by the way. So how can you say that nothing's ever been found when we're not allowed to look?
They did just find the little coin that was dedicated to the temple. They found that,
absolutely. And so there have been things that were associated. There was another artifact that's now at the Museum of the Bible that points to, do we know the high priest names, and we know the priestly weights and things. But in terms of any ritual vessels, there was one tiny pomegranate found, and it was since proved a forgery. It had said in the house of Yahweh, and you know the Israel Museum paid for that, put it front and center, and now we know that was a forgery. So it is just this little piece of propaganda that narrative uses to show that the Jewish temple never existed. Nobody believes it, but it would be nice to have one artifact that we could associate with this was part of the sacrificial process. This was part of the rituals that happened in the temple. We know that the temple was full of these things, that it was wealthy in these things. And so the Temple Mount movement and leaders in the Temple Mount movement have become tethered to the Copper Scroll Project in that way, and that we're some of the only ones out there actively looking for temple vessels and advocating for that cause. And so really the alliance was a natural one that happened over several years.
There's a thought that some of the temple vessels may be at Qumran?
Absolutely. When you look at the Copper Scroll, it is copious amounts of silver, gold, and vessels that, for one, can only the Jewish temple would have had access to that amount of wealth. In fact, the number of talents that you can count out in the Copper Scroll would be the equivalent of 640 tons. So really sort of an astronomical amount. Nothing outside of the Jewish temple would be able to be associated with that kind of treasure. Secondly, it uses words like holy, sacred, tithes, you know, words that really you also only associate with the temple. And my favorite part, in one line of the Copper Scroll, it talks about priestly vestments being varied. And by some translations of the Copper Scroll, it's not only priestly vestments, it has the Hebrew letter Yud behind it, meaning my priestly vestments, meaning a priest could have been one of the authors of the Copper Scroll. There's several different handwritings on the Copper Scroll, but could have been one of the authors, and they're hiding some of the things that they were able to get access to, because we knew, the Babylonians and the Romans, we knew prophetically what was going to happen. I mean, Jesus prophesied the second temple. Jeremiah made a career out of saying what was happening with the first temple. So there was plenty of warning time to be able to secret out some of the vessels from the temple before it was sacked.
We just have about a minute or so to go. What happens next? I mean, where is the project now, and what do you hope is going to happen here in the near future?
Sure. So Qumran itself is closed as an archaeological site, so that's been a problem for several years. However, a member of Knesset was able to do a scan at a few of the sites connected with the Copper Scroll, and we have a positive scan. I was telling Tom and Carl earlier that one of the scans, it looks like Fort Knox is buried under Qumran. So part of it was just waiting out the technology, being able to have proof, besides research, that something is there.
The fact that this is located in the West Bank doesn't
help.
It complicates things. That's
Doesn't
for sure.
help.
This is like the plot of a television series or a Hollywood film, but it's the real deal. The Copper Scroll. The book is by Shelley Neese. It chronicles the efforts of Jim Barfield and others to find out what exactly is buried at Qumran and how this might change the world's view of what exactly is Israel and the Jewish connection to the Temple Mount. and, of course, a prophesied third temple. You find out more about this book at the skywatchtvstore.com. And, boy, don't miss any of the other programs coming up in this series as we continue to discuss the future of the Temple Mount and the prophetic implications for all of us as believers in Jesus Christ. With Tom Horn, Carl Gallups, and Shelley Neese, I'm Derek Gilbert. We thank you for watching as we keep watch. This is Skywatch TV.
Millions of people from around the globe were stunned when U.S. President Donald Trump shocked the world by recognizing Jerusalem as the eternal capital of Israel and ordering the American embassy to be moved there.
The United States finally and officially recognized Jerusalem as the true capital of Israel and opened our embassy in the historic and sacred land of Jerusalem.
Over 2,000 years have elapsed since Jesus Christ warned of a day when a man of sin, the Antichrist, would appear to lead the world into deception and destruction.
Even Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu admits that biblical prophecies are unfolding, that Donald Trump is a King Cyrus-like figure leading the world into a new era of man.
President Trump, by recognizing history, you have made history. The Temple Mount is in our hands.
Violent protests continued in the Middle East today over President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital.
And now the official Sanhedrin in Israel declare President Trump is advancing a prophetic process that will usher in, when the time comes, the rebuilding of the Third Temple.
As the world awaits, a secret, incendiary scheme is underway by religious authorities, government agents, and Jewish rabbis to build a third temple.
When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in that holy place, then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be again.
The rabbis, Donald Trump, and the top secret plan to build the third temple.
Archaeology is way cool. You know, there are not many times when you're actually talking about archaeology and it's like Hollywood, but that's what we're talking about this week on Skywatch TV. Welcome, I'm Derek Gilbert. Joining me on the panel, the authors of 3 brand new books that connect archaeologists and their research to prophecy and the fulfillment of prophecy, specifically on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Joining me, the CEO of Skywatch TV and the author of best-selling books such as Petrus Romanus, Exo Vaticana, The Final Roman Emperor, and his brand new book, The Rabbis, Donald Trump, and the Secret Plan to Build the Third Temple, Dr. Tom Horn.
Good to be here.
Pastor Carl Gallups, the best-selling author of Gods and Thrones, Gods of Ground Zero, and his new book, The Rabbi, The Secret Message, and the Identity of Messiah. Carl, welcome.
Thank you, Derek. It's good to be here.
And a fascinating discussion, and we're going to pick up where we left off last week on the research here. What was found at Qumran? How does it connect to the Third Temple? The book is The Copper Scroll Project. We welcome Shelley Neese back to Skywatch TV.
Thanks for having me.
You were talking about scans at Qumran that were done recently by a member of Knesset, and the results appear to be very, very promising. What is this all about? I mean, we can't let that go.
Right. So one thing, like I was talking about last week in terms of waiting out the technology, we were able to get our hands on a Lorenz metal detector, which is a $10,000 metal detector. One thing is that the soil around the Dead Sea is already mineralized. In the past, metal detectors wouldn't even work there. They would just give false positives. You know, they would beep if they touched the steel toe of your boot. And so The Lorenz can tell the difference between ferrous and non-ferrous metals, so it can tell the difference between gold, silver, and bronze and other metals, and it can also tell you how deep and how large the item is that you scanned. Now, we knew from the copper scroll that we are looking for things buried deep, we are looking for non-ferrous, and we are looking for large items. So don't even bother us if it's a first century Tyrian shekel or anything like that.
So
we
big
were
chunks
looking
of gold and silver.
for big chunks of gold and silver. Seems greedy.
To keep it simple, big chunks of gold and silver. Yeah.
But honestly,
Chariots
and that's
filled with
what
gold.
this metal detector could do for us. So we had this metal detector, but we couldn't get a permit to use it from the Israel Antiquities Authority. Today, Qumran is declared a closed archaeological site. So there are no excavations going on since about 2011. It was like a shemitah for the ruins, and much like the Egyptian pyramids and things like that. And so that was a problem because we feel like Qumran's story is not done, and not everything has been found at Qumran yet. And so it took a really gutsy member of Israel's Knesset, Moshe Feiglin. He has pretty much cut his teeth on the fact that he prays on the Temple Mount regularly, gets arrested regularly, and then goes to his Knesset meetings. And so I knew that if we needed someone with guts, we needed someone who was attached to the Temple Mount movement and really could cheerlead this. And so I didn't put words in his mouth. I didn't put the idea in his head, but he volunteered to actually take the Lorenz metal detector and go to Qumran and scan a few of the sites. I mean, there's 60 plus sites in the Copper Scroll, but even if we could just scan a few of them, we could get an idea, and especially the more accessible ones, get an idea if the research is right or wrong. And because there's no guarantees that in 2,000 years that the Romans didn't already find these things. Josephus talks in one part of Jewish antiquities about priests kind of giving up some information. And so we don't know. Maybe this was the information that they gave up and the Romans were able to track it down. And so if we could just find some sort of positive scan. And so Moshe Feiglin scanned 5 of the sites. We walked into Qumran, by the way, and broad daylight. He pays with his credit card for the ticket. You know, it's very known what we're doing. There's 2 armed guards usually at Qumran. One of them approached Moshe Feiglin. He answered what he was doing, you know, something in Hebrew about doing research. And the guard, and I talk about this in the book, but he did something very unusual. And I still don't know to this day if this is some sort of workaround with Jewish law, but he went over and faced the visitor center so that we weren't in his visual, so he wasn't seeing what was happening, and so that he wouldn't be a witness. And he sang and he danced and he faced the other way.
Kind of like
Exactly. Exactly. But I'm sure there was some like law
something more
surrounding
spiritual
it.
than that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so we were able to scan away. Now, one of the sites, the most prominent of the sites pointing in the Copper Scroll, is the last site in the Copper Scroll, because I'll get to that later about what it possibly hints at, but it's a cave, and it looks like it's a cave that the entrance has been closed shut purposefully. And so really, if there was any positive scan out at that cave, there's nothing out there. There's no tourist site out there. It's sort of northwest of Qumran, about 300 yards away. So there shouldn't even be any real human traffic or anything like that. And so when we scanned that cave, that was where it was the largest. It was big chunks of gold and silver, like what we were talking about. And we had worked with the Lorenz metal detector many times trying to make sure that there was no false positives. And that's what Jim Barfield was the most scared of in this situation. So we've never had a false positive before or since, but yet what came up in the readings, it doesn't come up real time. You have to download it later. So imagine that moment when he's watching it come through on his computer and realizing what this means. And so that's where we're at today with that information.
Now, and you said you would maybe hint a little bit later
Sure.
what you think is going on at that site?
Right. So in that area, so we know from stories, there's a lot of oral traditions associated with the first temple, not the second temple, about items being secreted away before the Babylonians destroyed the first temple. And so we see that in 2nd Maccabees, that Jeremiah was in charge of an operation and that he hid the items so well that his own followers that were with him couldn't find them right after he hid them. And Jeremiah responds and says that it'll basically be in the time of the Messiah, that in the age of mercy, that these things will be uncovered again. And there's also talking about Kabbalists and these things. The 1600s, there was a Kabbalistic document called the Treatise of Temple Vessels. It reads, it's the exact opposite of the Copper Scroll, where the Copper Scroll is like a dry inventory. This is like a lavish display of angels and priests that were all working together to secret these things. Interestingly, though, the Treatise of the Temple Vessel ends after it goes really into like all of the things that the priest and with the assistance of angels, what they were able to hide away to before the Babylonians destroyed the temple. It says that they wrote it down on a luach nechoshet copper scroll.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's amazing.
Right.
Wow. And so again, I'm going to keep pushing because I want to know, because I think that this could be connected to the investigative work that we did in the writing of my new book, The Rabbis, Donald Trump, and the Secret Plan to Build a Third Temple.
Right. So the Copper Scroll, I know what you're getting at, and I'll get straight to it. The Copper Scroll never straight says the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
It does say, in some translations, gleaming chamber, which to me sounds pretty Copper Scrollish. It sounds pretty Ark of the Covenant. Yep. And there's another translation by a man named Al Walters, a very traditional translation of the Copper Scroll, and he translates it, and this is my favorite, Cavern of the Shekhinah, which is one of the earliest uses of Shekhinah that we ever see. And so to me, when I hear those are almost more powerful, that coded reference to something super holy that could only really be associated with the Ark of the Covenant. Because the Ark of the Covenant is very unusual in Judaism in terms of this is not an iconic religion. Only the Ark applies
and you
to
mentioned
this.
you mentioned the cave there, and it looks like the mouth of the cave has been sealed off. And you remember Derek, the late Christian genius David Flynn, when he wrote his book, Temple at the Center of Time. But he did significant research into Mount Nebo, the whole story, the Maccabean retelling, and he came to the same conclusion that it's, obviously you can't prove this unless you can get permission to go in there and open this cave up.
Right.
But his suspicion was that of all of the places indicated in antiquity, that the Ark of the Covenant could be in the mouth of that cave.
Right. When you think about it, Tisha B'Av is when Jews mourn the loss of the temple, the first temple and the second temple. There's just silence when it comes to the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant is what made the temple, what imparted its holiness, and yet we have no day of mourning for it. There's no indication. It's just silent, which to me means that it's still to come back in the story.
Well, and so in the age of mercy, this is the Kabbalists all looking forward to this time. And we too, as evangelical Christians, we also believe that the time is coming when a third temple will be built. We can talk about why we believe that to be true. They're looking for a messianic era. We too are looking for a kind of messianic era or a second coming of Christ. But to this location, that was, I loved your book, by the way.
Oh, thank
I mean, I'm reading this book and I can hear dun 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 dun. This is really well written, very intriguing. I learned a ton of information that I didn't know, and I know our audience will too.
That's actually the most important thing to me, just that people learn from it.
No, it was excellent. But you said, look, I'm an Okie. Shekinah, right? How do you say it?
Shekinah, but you say it like that.
Good enough, right?
Totally.
But that's totally connected to the Holy of Holies and to the presence of the Ark of the Covenant. And the reason that is important to me and the Copper Scroll research and Carl's research is because, and I go into different ways in which the third temple could be built. Because right now, for the most part, people say, well, the Muslims have control. It's under Jordanian, the Waqf. I mean, you're just not going to go up there and build a temple and start a world war. That's the common answer. I go into different scenarios in the book in which this could happen. There are ways in which this could happen. But to me, if some way, one way or another, either by somehow somebody gets permission to dig, or an earthquake splits the ground open. God has done this before too.
It's on a fault line.
It is on a fault line, and they've had something like 4 or 5 dozen earthquakes in that area over the last 12 months. So it's kind of active right now too, which could affect the Temple Mount, but also this area in Qumran.
Qumran is on that same fault line.
It's on the same fault line, and we're both eschatologists. We believe in end times prophecy, and earthquakes play a big role in end times prophecy. In fact, it talks about the mountain cleaving asunder at the second coming of Christ. So there's all kind of ways in which this could happen. But one way or another, to me, if the Ark of the Covenant was somehow discovered or manifest, or maybe is already being held somewhere and that for whatever reason is made known. That would give international support, I think, to the building of the third temple. All of the Abrahamic faiths would agree that there is only one place. There's only one place that would fit the biblical mandate from God, from the God of these religions, right, where the Ark of the Covenant has to be kept, and that's in the Holy of Holies. You wouldn't put it in a museum. You're not going to put it on tour. That would be sacrilege, right? It'd be blasphemy. And so I think that from the United Nations to the Muslim communities to the Jewish communities to the American communities, I think you would find all of a sudden we can set aside our differences and somehow we can accommodate. Perhaps with, and some of the Muslim and Jewish scholars have written about this, that we could accommodate a third temple on the Temple Mount next to the Dome of the Rock. So there could be a way to do it. And if the religious authorities agreed with it, and they've talked about this too, like a prophetic priest who could say, we're going to recognize this, we're going to bless this. Now, after we're going to go to a commercial break here, maybe we can also get your feedback on this so-called second temple site idea, the city of David. Maybe it isn't even the recognized Temple Mount.
It's a fascinating discussion. Again, we're talking about the 35-acre piece of ground that, in the grand scheme of this huge earth on which we live, is not a very large place. And yet, all of the world's attention seems to be focused on it and will continue to be focused on it as we head closer and closer to the time of Messiah's return. We're talking about the Copper Scroll Project, the Rabbi, the Secret Message, and the Identity of Messiah, and the Rabbis, Donald Trump, and the Secret Plan to Build the Third Temple. The authors joining us here, and our conversation continues on Skywatch TV after this. Welcome back to Skywatch TV. I'm Derek Gilbert. Please take advantage of our free mobile app because this program and all of the content that we offer is available to you through your smartphone or tablet, regardless of your operating system, wherever you are on planet Earth. News items that the major media overlooks, and of course our broadcast programs we can't get on network television, our weekly science programs, Into the Multiverse and Sci Friday, and more, all available with a free download, and the links to those app stores are posted at skywatchtv.com. We're talking about the Third Temple, the Temple Mount, and various aspects of it geopolitically and prophetically. Author Shelley Neese, their new book, The Copper Scroll Project, Pastor Carl Gallup's his new book, The Rabbi, the Secret Message, and the Identity of Messiah, and Tom Horn, The Rabbis, Donald Trump, and the Secret Plan to Build the Third Temple. Carl, in your book, dealing with Rabbi Kaduri, the Orthodox rabbi who claimed that the identity of Messiah was revealed to him, was prophetically looking forward to that revelation or the day when Messiah be revealed and the third temple. How does this all fit into this discussion here? Or what did the rabbi see, and how does this fit with the third temple?
Well, he is famous for having, for issuing what we would call prophecies or proclamations to the Jewish people. He was highly revered around the world in the Orthodox Jewish community, but particularly in Israel. When he passed, he was 108 years old, deeply connected to politics, religion, prime ministers, presidents of Israel, etc. So when he would speak these prophetic things, the major Israeli media would carry his proclamations, or as we would think of some of them, prophecies. And I'm talking about secular, what we would call secular media. Of course, it's a little hard to separate secular from Orthodox in Israel, but it would just be there. They would have an article, maybe front page, Rabbi Kaduri says, and then it was like gospel. If he said it, then everybody's looking. Well, several years prior to his Yeshua revelation, his Jesus revelation, which is what shook the world, which is primarily what my book's about, but he said, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's almost an exact quote, but he was calling for, he said, in this age of mercy, in this year of mercy, which is a big Orthodox thing for, look, Messianic flag. We're living in the end times. We're living close to the coming, they would say coming, we would say return of Messiah. And he said, in this age of mercy, in this year of mercy, I'm calling for Jews all over the world to come to Israel. Come to Israel, return to your homeland. And he went on to say, because something is getting ready to happen. There's a shaking coming. There are cataclysmic events that are going to shake the world, and you need to be here. And one of the reasons that he gave was because you need to come for the building of the temple on the Temple Mount. You need to come. But now, remember, this is prior to Jerusalem being legally returned, if you will. Prior to the Knesset's declaration, legal declaration, yes, Jerusalem is ours now. We claim it.
And Israel is a Jewish state.
Yes, and Israel's a Jewish state. And so it's if this really was from God to Kaduri, then it was prophetic, because he would have had to have seen, or at least had an unction, if not a vision, that sometime soon Jerusalem is going to be restored to Israel, which would give Israel and Jerusalem the opportunity to even begin seriously discussing the Temple Mount. But at the same time, he leaves the note that was posted on the website, that was translated, that said, Jesus is the real Messiah.
And it's not lost on us. Derek, you were there last year, the 70th anniversary.
Right.
These dates and times from 1948, 70 years, some even
the Shemitah year and the Jubilee year.
And of course, Donald Trump would have been counseled, right? Behind the scenes, being told about the significance to the Kabbalists, also though just to evangelical Christians. You know, since 1948, we've been talking about this generation will not pass away.
Yes.
So very important to different people, you know, that are Judeo-Christian.
Yes.
And so it's interesting, the influence that you write about that Kaduri had also on his students, who are rabbis, and what some of them have been saying since Donald Trump came on the scene, which is, of course, after Kaduri's predictions. But so they were looking for something, and Donald Trump arrives on the scene. And if you listen to them, they're not even being they're being straightforward.
Right.
They're not even trying to hide the fact that they think that Donald Trump was one of the major instruments, because of the power of the United States of America, the fact that they are our closest ally in Israel, in the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem, and then announcing that we recognize Jerusalem as the eternal capital of Israel. That has to be, for them, one of the major things that Kaduri was talking about. And we also can see how much they have directly connected this, right, to the building of the third temple. And several of them have just came right out and said that Donald Trump, I love this Adam Berkowitz from Breaking Israel News, you know, where he says, Donald Trump is the gematria of Messiah for the house of David, the number 424. So again, this is the mysticism, right?
Sure.
He wrote that. He says, now that's not to say that Donald Trump is the Messiah, but that his presidency will usher in the Messianic era. And rabbi after rabbi over there have said that. Now, you also have the Sanhedrin, you know, that authorized these two coins, right? This gold coin, big heavy gold coin, and then this one. And both of these have the picture. I don't know if you can zoom in on that, but both of them have the picture of Donald Trump and the ancient Persian King Cyrus on the front, right? So this is just in your face telling Donald Trump why we believe God raised you up, because Cyrus was the one that helped them after the Babylonian exile to rebuild their temple, the second temple.
And Cyrus returned the treasures.
He returned the treasures, but also on the back of both of these coins, which is also in your face, is a depiction of the third temple, right? But here is the official brochure, right? Both of these coins have an official brochure. Listen to what the Sanhedrin approved being written in this. It says, President Trump is advancing a prophetic process that will usher in, when the time comes, the rebuilding of the third temple. So now, you know that Donald Trump, they're working behind the scenes to create a peace, you know, what is it, the deal of the century or whatever Donald Trump's been calling it in his own kind of inarticulate way, right? But Jared Kushner has been kind of working on that for Donald Trump. He's a practicing Orthodox Jew. His wife converted to Judaism. So they're keeping that connection with this whole kind of religious, because they're practicing Jews, right? So they're keeping that connection with the Jewish community in Israel. And all of my research has led me to believe that this conversation about the third temple, I'm not saying that it's any part of this Palestinian deal, or whether it's even going to be a two-state deal or whatever. We'll know by the time these programs air, or hopefully we will. But there has been talk about it. And there is a plan that is unfolding behind the scenes. And I go into great I think, some of my best investigative work ever. Now, the connection also included, however, the Saudis, because there is a plan that a lot of people don't know about that could cause the next, intifada or holy war or whatever, to turn over control of the holy sites in Israel to the Saudis. Now, the reason that this process has kind of slowed down was the murder of the journalist Khashoggi, and our own CIA saying that the Saudi crown prince was directly responsible for that murder. But the Saudi prince has been involved in these behind-the-scenes conversations about once control of the Temple Mount and other holy sites are turned over to the Saudis, there's going to be a much more open opportunity to discuss publicly what could happen with the building of the third temple and the Temple Mount. And note that he went out of his way to meet with evangelical leaders, the Saudi crown prince did. He said publicly that Israel has a right to their own land and to be a nation. So all of that was happening until this murder came along. So now there's a bigger question about how will some of this other not yet public information be manifest.
Yeah, there's some deep state maneuvering going on behind the scenes there. We don't have time to get into it here, but there's deepest state,
demonic,
principalities, powers, and cosmic rulers over this present darkness.
Yeah. Well, and maybe Derek, in the fourth and final show in this series, it'd be really great if you could weigh in on the Temple Mount, Mount Zion, and why these principalities and powers have an interest in that real estate.
Well, it all goes back to the Har Moed, the Mount of Assembly. So I'll have to ask the correct Hebrew pronunciation of that.
You're doing great. You're doing great.
This is fascinating discussion because we're dealing with matters of eternal consequence here. Yes, the geopolitics is what we see in the news headlines, but the theopolitics, the principalities and powers behind the scenes, that's really what's driving the action here. The new books, you want these for your reference library. The Copper Scroll Project, The Rabbi, The Secret Message and the Identity of Messiah, and The Rabbi's Donald Trump and the Secret Plan to Build the Third Temple. You'll find those at Skywatch TV Store, skywatchtvstore.com. With Tom Horn, Pastor Carl Gallups, and Shelley Neese, I'm Derek Gilbert. We thank you for watching as we keep watch. This is Skywatch TV.
Millions of people from around the globe were stunned when U.S. President Donald Trump shocked the world by recognizing Jerusalem as the eternal capital of Israel and ordering the American embassy to be moved there.
The United States finally and officially recognized Jerusalem as the true capital of Israel and opened our embassy in the historic and sacred land of Jerusalem.
Over 2,000 years have elapsed since Jesus Christ warned of a day when a man of sin, the Antichrist, would appear to lead the world into deception and destruction.
Even Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu admits that biblical prophecies are unfolding, that Donald Trump is a King Cyrus-like figure leading the world into a new era of man.
President Trump, by recognizing history, you have made history. The Temple Mount is in our hands.
Violent protests continued in the Middle East today over President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital.
And now the official Sanhedrin in Israel declare President Trump is advancing a prophetic process that will usher in, when the time comes, the rebuilding of the Third Temple.
As the world awaits, a secret, incendiary scheme is underway by religious authorities, government agents, and Jewish rabbis to build a third temple.
When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in that holy place, then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be again.
The rabbis, Donald Trump, and the top secret plan to build the third temple.
A little spot about 35 acres, is going to be the site of the final battle of this age. And that will be the topic of our conversation today as we conclude our series on the Temple Mount and the recent geo- and theopolitical developments around it. Welcome to Skywatch TV. I'm Derek Gilbert. Joining me, the authors of 3 important new books that you want to have for your reference library because they deal with this very important topic. Again, not just geopolitically, but prophetically. We're talking with Skywatch TV CEO and the author of the new book, The Rabbis, Donald Trump, and the Secret Plan to Build, the top secret plan to build the Third Temple, Dr. Thomas Horn.
Good to be here.
The best-selling author of Gods of Ground Zero, Gods and Thrones, and the new book, The Rabbi, The Secret Message and the Identity of Messiah, Pastor Carl Gallups.
Thank you, Derek.
And the fascinating, almost like a whodunit of archaeology here, the Copper Scroll Project, an ancient secret, fuels the battle for the Temple Mount. We welcome Shelley Neese back to the program.
Thank you.
The reason I say this has prophetic implications. We talked about the Third Temple and the reason for being the reason for all of the angst and tension over the Temple Mount. But Carl, in Gods of Ground Zero, you point out that is not only the original battleground in the long spiritual war, but in my first book, the Great Inception, talk about the importance of holy mountains and Zion being the first and the last holy mountain. That's where God has placed his name forever.
And Zion, for those that watch and don't understand, is what we would call the Temple Mount.
Right. Mount Zion in Jerusalem today. They changed the name of the mountain back in the 1st century because they found a taller mountain was probably more appropriate for but actually, we're talking about the Temple Mount is Zion.
Right.
And let me just say that everything that I'm getting ready to say, some of it will shock our audience because they might not have ever heard this before, and I would just say shame on them for not reading Gods of Ground Zero then. But in Gods of Ground Zero, everything I'm getting ready to say, this will keep me from saying over and over, I've got it documented, it is documented. I'm not pulling this out of my back pocket. This is heavily documented from scholars, connecting the dots in Scripture, Hebrew word studies, Greek word studies, etc. But here's the truth of the matter. The whole Bible, the purpose of the biblical story is to focus on what happened in the Garden of Eden, which is the fall, to the restoration of the Garden of Eden, which has always been in the spiritual realm sealed with the veil dropped when the sin came, the cherubim guarding it in Jerusalem. Now, before people freak out, this is what God says in the Old Testament. It's what the prophets say over and over again in the Old Testament. It's what Jesus says in the New Testament. It's what the biblical writers say in the New Testament. It's what the last 2 chapters of Revelation say in the New Testament. That the whole reason for the Bible, the whole reason for the crucifixion, the resurrection, the ascension, the incarnation, I went back, the incarnation, crucifixion, resurrection, the whole reason for it all is the restitution of all things. Well, what's all things? It began in the garden. Ezekiel chapter 5, God said of Jerusalem, I have put you in the center of all the nations. Then he tells the children of Israel when he brings them out of Egypt, I'm taking you to the place where I have put my name. So he takes them eventually to Israel. Eventually Jerusalem's the capital. What does he tell Solomon? This is where I have put my name. Now, what is this temple for? Because my name is here. Well, so what does the temple represent? It represents fellowship with me. Well, how do we get to it? Well, the high priest has to bring blood sacrifice, which is what happened in the garden when the fellowship was lost. There had to be a blood. They were trying to cover themselves with leaves, and God says, no, there's going to be bloodshed over this. I mean, it all connects. And then the book of Hebrews tells us 5 different times. I've got it quoted in my book. 5 different times it says, and everything, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is what it says, and everything that's on the Temple Mount and everything that's in Jerusalem is a copy of what lies behind the veil.
Right.
The real thing is just behind the veil. And so the bottom line is, Jesus says in Revelation chapter 2, verse 8, he says, and to he who overcomes, I will give the right to eat of the tree of life, which is in paradise. I prove in the book the word paradise is the English word from the Greek word paradisios. It is absolutely synonymous with the Hebrew Gan Eden, Garden of Eden. I will give to eat from the tree of life, which is in the Garden of Eden, Gan Eden, paradise. Then you get to Revelation 20 and 21, and then I saw the new Jerusalem come down, which is basically a way of saying the veil was opened like a scroll. The sky opened, the face of God. The people hid, you know. But then now in chapter 21, he says, I'm making all things new. I heard the voice from the throne. Chapter 22 says, and there's the throne of God, there's the throne of the Lamb, there's the river of life, and there's the tree of life. It's always been there. Jesus says, which is in the Garden of Eden, not what will be or what will be restored or what used to be, but it will be again. No, he says it's in the Garden of Eden. Well, where is it? Hebrews says it's behind the veil, which is why when Jesus died, the veil was rent in two as a symbolic illustration of, okay, there's something on the other side, which when Jesus told the thief on the cross, today you will be with me in Gan Eden.
Yeah.
Which is where?
Exactly.
Jerusalem.
Paradise,
The point
right.
is the whole Bible's about Garden of Eden and Jerusalem. They're the same place. There's just a spiritual dimension and then what we would call the earthly dimension. One's just as real as the other. The illustration I give is the fish at the bottom of the ocean know nothing about the 7 billion humans that live just above them through the surface, but we're here. And 25 million other species of real flesh and blood reality. We are here. They never know it. There's two dimensions side by side. Our dimension envelops their dimension on a globe, hanging in space on nothing. They don't have a clue about any of that. It's the same way we are. God's Word is telling us you don't have a clue about the multiple dimensions of reality that exist. But right behind the veil of this scroll that will open, Jerusalem is the center of everything. Satan knows it on the Temple Mount. The dome of the rock, it's inscribed on the foundation stone. This is the location of the foundation of the Garden of Eden. When you come through the gateway to it, there's a turquoise kind of stone there, and it says the stone of Eden. And then over the gateway, it says something like the gateway to the Garden of Eden. Satan knows it. He knows what it is. And then, of course, the rock, the Evan Sheti, did I say that right?
Foundation stone,
Yeah,
Evan
Evan Shtia. The foundation stone, I've got all that in the book too, of where the temple was located and where the ark was resting, which is now the center of the dome of the rock. Where Abraham sacrificed his son.
Right.
And the ancient Hebrews said, this is the foundation stone upon which the whole world was made. It's where the Garden of Eden was made. I mean, the Jews say it, the Muslims say it, the temple said it, the mosque says it, the book of Hebrews says it, Jesus says it in Revelation, chapter 21 and chapter 22 say it there. All of the Old Testament says it. This is what's happening in the world. This is why the world and the nations went crazy when Donald Trump said, here's Jerusalem. It's the rightful ownership of Israel. This is deeply spiritual.
And you know, that what a great kind of encapsulation right there of how it started, why it was important, why it is still important, why God's name is there. But also prophetically speaking, why it will also be very important. And the agencies that are working behind the scene, right, the supernaturalism working behind the scene, are looking also. They have an interest in that mount.
Yeah.
And that's why it kind of boils over into our earthly politics and whatever, why there's contention between the Palestinians and the Jews and control over the Temple Mount, because behind them, what Paul says, we wrestle not with flesh and blood, but against principalities. Those word cosmocrators, as you know better than I do, they carry with it the idea that these are heavenly entities that work in and through human political counterparts to try to accomplish their will on earth. And yet now they have to contest with the fact that Jesus says, wherever I put my feet becomes holy ground. And I love Derek's, oh my gosh, his book, The Great Inception, and then the last one, The Last Clash of the Titans, and you and him kind of tracking along the same stuff at the same time, where Jesus comes down off the mount after the transfiguration. He sends out, his 70, the numerical equivalencies there spoke volumes to the Hebrews that he was directly responding to the original Watchers, the Titans. This battle over the Temple Mount is another way of using Derek's last book titled The Last Clash of the Titans, because that's where this is all coming back. It's what it's all headed toward right now.
Yeah, the numbers and what Jesus did spoke volumes, not only to the Hebrews, but even more so, as the New Testament says, to the rulers and principalities of the unseen realm, spoke volumes to the demonic realm. Jesus, 40 days. Why didn't he just resurrect from the grave and go straight up to heaven? No, he spent 40 days doing this to Satan. And the number 40 is the number of judgment. 40 days in the wilderness, 40 days of rain for the flood, 40 days, 40 days.
Even before that, though, before the 40 days that he spent with the brothers in Galilee, he spent 3 days preaching to the captives.
That's right.
Which was down in the abyss, preaching to those, as our friend Dr. Michael Heiser says, he basically summarizes it by saying, bet you didn't expect to see me here, but here's a news flash. At dawn of the third day, I'm out of here and you're still dead.
But that third day is also connected to some of the corrupted religious ideas around the Titans, the different meals and feasts that were held, and how they would rise up from out of the underworld.
Right, the veneration of the dead by the pagan Canaanites, where they would summon these, what they believed were their dead ancestors. The Council of the Ditanu, the Titans, to a ritual meal, and they would travel one day and then another, and then arrive at the sanctuary of El, which was their chief god, on Mount Hermon at dawn of the third day, to be revivified and resurrected. Well, Jesus, God totally reversed that ritual, and again, with the 3 days of preaching to the captives, here's what's going to happen, boys. I'm getting out, and you're still dead.
And again, this goes back to the whole biblical message is the straightening out of the perversion that Satan started in the Garden of Eden.
That's right.
Because everything you're talking about, the Titans and the Titahu and the ritual meals and the dawn of the third day and all that, is a perversion of
an original revelation.
And that's right. And so Jesus Christ's mission is God in the flesh, God with us mission, not only to provide for our salvation, but to reverse the curse and to bring everything back to the restitution of all things. And where's Jesus returning? Mount of Olives. Where's that? Jerusalem. Where's he going to rule and reign? Jerusalem. The Old Testament says that the nations will be judged from Jerusalem. Satan will be judged from Jerusalem.
The nations will go in and out. That's where they're going to be judged.
It's all there. And that's where the Garden of Eden was. That's the restitution.
Now, there's something here that's very interesting, and that is that we're all focused on the Temple Mount. Evangelical Christians have their ideas about how this is going to play out in end times events. The Jews do too. And they also believe that the Temple Mount and the building of a third temple is what will actually, initiate the Messiah ben David, the actual moment in time where the Messiah will arrive. And by the way, some of those rabbis that were Kaduri's disciples, is that a good term to use in terms of?
That's the term
they've said a couple of things. One, they've said the Messiah is already here. And when the time is right, he's going to make himself known. So some of them are already saying that he's already here.
And that comes from the two Messiah concept, Messiah ben Joseph, Messiah ben David.
Right.
And so that's could be perfectly correct in their mindset that a man is here making the way for Messiah ben David, but he's here as a powerful opening. As a matter of fact, I document in my brand new book that some rabbis, some Orthodox Jews have even pointed to Donald Trump and said that he may be Messiah ben Joseph.
Let's take our break. When we come back, let's get right back on that. Because I also have some questions for all of you brainiacs.
Well, then I need to leave this table. The both of you brainiacs.
I'll stay right here.
Yes, you must.
What's happening on the Temple Mount and what will happen? We're talking about the brand new books by Tom Horn, Pastor Carl Gallups, and Shelley Neese. The rabbis, Donald Trump and the top secret plan to build a third temple, the rabbi, the secret message, and the identity of Messiah, and the Copper Scroll Project. Will tell you more about the books and how to get them, and come right back on Skywatch TV. Welcome back to Skywatch TV. I'm Derek Gilbert. Joining me, the authors of the new books you've just heard about, Tom Horn, Pastor Carl Gallups, and Shelley Neese. We're going to dive right back into this. All of this is about the war for God's holy mount, his mount of assembly. It's all about the mount of assembly. Isaiah 14 makes it clear the rebel from Eden wants to set his mount of assembly, his Har Moed, as supreme in the cosmos. And actually, it's a weird transliteration trying to reverse engineer what John wrote in Revelation, Armageddon. Scholars, assuming they knew whether he was writing a gamma or an ayin, or, I'm not a Hebrew speaker or writer, but anyway, translated Har Moed into Har Megiddon, and so they moved the final battle, Armageddon, from Jerusalem to Megiddo, where there's no mountain. So this is all about the Temple Mount and about Jerusalem.
And I noticed, like, even with the like ISIS and their ideas, their theology around the coming of Mahdi, right? But they have their Antichrist figure, and this battle ensues until the Antichrist armies beats them all the way down to, what is it, like 5,000 5,000 people. And where do they wind up? They wind up on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem when finally the Mahdi comes and saves everybody, right? So again, you have this plagiarism of an original revelation that these supernatural agents twist and distort and try to conform into their own versions, I guess, to draw people away from God and to draw them into their own version. But the point is, they're saying that this battle is going to wind up on the Temple Mount. We're saying this battle is going to wind up on the Temple Mount. Now, just quickly, for people that are watching this wondering, well, why would we as Christians believe that something like this is going to happen? The Temple Mount's going to be built. I mean, the third temple's going to be built, and then there's going to be chaos, and then the second coming of Jesus. And it's because the Bible says this. Daniel in the Old Testament, Daniel 9:27, he talks about the prince that will come, the Antichrist, and how he will defile the holy place. Apostle Paul mentions it in 2 Thessalonians 2:3, where he talks about the Antichrist, the man of lawlessness, and how he's going to profane the temple when he enters it. Jesus, Matthew 24:15, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place. Stand in the holy place. Whosoever readeth, let him understand, right? So we recognize this. Some even believe in Revelation 11, where John is ordered to measure the temple, that he's actually looking at the third temple construction in the end times. So there's plenty in Scripture to believe that the third temple will be built. Why? Because it couldn't be desolated if it isn't there.
Right.
You know, and where Paul says that he will stand in the temple, showing himself that he is God, right? Above all other gods. So we think the third temple has to be built. However, here's where between Orthodox Jews and even many evangelical Christians, not all, some evangelical Christians believe that the third temple could also be used for God, won't be defiled by an Antichrist figure. But typical old school, Western evangelical, whatever, right? Dispensationalists. This is where we believe this is talking about Antichrist, and that the Jews for a period of time may be deceived by this political figure. They have to remember that the Jewish idea of Messiah really has more to do with a political figure that's going to win wars and fight battles and make them the head and not the tail, set them free, the age of mercy. It's not the same way we think about Jesus Christ.
And that's why they missed Jesus when he came the first time. They were looking for that
for something else.
They were looking for Messiah ben David instead of Messiah ben Yosef.
And in my new book, I go into all the different ways in which different people view eschatology, future events, end-time prophecy, and the role that the temple will play. And one of those is the old kind of Western evangelical idea that Antichrist will be accepted for a while as this messianic figure. But then when he defiles the temple, the Jews will know, oh, this is not the Messiah, this is a false man making claims, and they'll utterly reject him. And then you'll have the second coming of Jesus Christ. So,
well, now the two Messiah concept that the Jews have, Messiah ben Joseph comes first and Messiah ben David follows up. How will that fit with our understanding of the Antichrist as a deceiver? I mean, if a charismatic figure comes along who appears to save Israel from an imminent military crisis.
I write about this in my new book about the Rabbi and the Messiah, and I spend several chapters dealing with this concept of the two Messiahs. Now, for those watching this that have never heard of this, and they say, what in the world is he talking about? This is heavily documented. It's all over the internet. The Orthodox Jews know this concept. Not all. See, Judaism...
I think it faded away once Christian apologetics came onto the scene, but until first century, this was the common standard of thought.
It was, and what I was going to say is, another thing is a lot of people don't realize that Orthodox Judaism is not this one monolithic, or it's divided into denominations, just like evangelical Christianity. So there are sects or denominations of Orthodox Judaism that still hold to this idea of Messiah ben Joseph, Messiah ben David, the two Messiahs. And I know that Kaduri did. He wrote about it.
So
And
did
his
Rambam.
followers did.
So up until the 13th century, it was still pretty standard.
Well, and some of the current dialogue out of Israel, there are a few of these rabbis that have become very close to referring to Donald Trump as this first messianic figure that paves the way for then the coming of the man who will actually be the Messiah. And Derek, one question, because I wrote a book years ago called Zenith 2016. The book really only does one very simple thing. It asks, why were there so many ancient cultures that looked forward to the year 2016, some of them by thousands of years? Reformer preachers like Jonathan Edwards wrote letters to Yale University why the Antichrist will be here in the year 2016. And the whole book was just, why did so many believe that that was the case? Now look at what happened. In 2016, the election of Donald Trump, and it does seem that a whole lot of stuff has been put into motion with religious authorities around the world saying Messiah is here and he's getting ready to present himself. And speaking of Kabbalism and Jews, in the Zohar, 700 years ago, they predicted when the Messiah would appear on earth. They said it would happen between the years 2012 and 2016. It's right in the Zohar. So this belief has been there for a long time, and you got to wonder, were they keying in on something like Kaduri saying,
did he embrace that?
Did who embrace
well,
what?
it's in the
Kaduri
Zohar, and he was
embraced.
a student of the Zohar.
Okay, and so he embraced the idea of Messiah ben David and Messiah ben
Exactly,
Joseph.
absolutely. As a matter of fact, some of the prophecies, and again, I have this documented, and I explained it at a level where everybody sitting on a pew in any church can understand. I know this can get deep and can get very scholastic, but I just explain it where pastors in pulpits, people in the pews, Sunday school classes, you can get this stuff. Because if you're not steeped in this Orthodox Jewish mentality, one of the denominations of it, it can be overwhelming. But Kaduri was steeped in it, and he spoke of Messiah several years ago, a dozen years ago. He says he's here, he's already here. But when you read everything that he said, he was speaking about Messiah ben Joseph because he's preparing the way for what is to come in Messiah ben David. Now, for those watching that don't have a clue what we're talking about, the two Messiah concept is Ben means son of, so Messiah, son of Joseph, is a figure that they look at who is a totally human figure, but he's very influential, very powerful, maybe military or political, or maybe both, like King David was military, political, and religious, okay? Something like that would prepare the nation. Because see, Israel, when they're looking for the Messiah, they're not calling upon individuals to repent near as much as they are this nationalistic repent, like John the Baptist. You know, a lot of people mistook that. There's a national movement. But then he pointed and said, no, there's the Lamb that takes away the sin of the world. You got to repent. Okay, well, so the Orthodox Jews who've rejected Christ, they're still looking for this nationalistic repentance and for the rebuilding of a temple. A lot of the denominations of Judaism are, because they believe that in order, they got to get their national hearts right, individual hearts too, yes, but national heart right. Then you got to have a temple, because Malachi says, behold, the Lord you are looking for will suddenly come to his temple. And who can stand? Well, the temple's gone, so there's no temple. And oh my gosh, the last book says he's coming to his temple, so we've got to have a temple. So there's that big movement. Kaduri spoke of this. He felt like that messianic Messiah ben Joseph spirit was there, and it was right on the verge of the Messiah coming. And so he leaves a note saying, I can tell you who the real Messiah is. He leaves the note. It's Jesus. So,
well, again, the principalities and powers, the spirits acting behind the scenes, are the reason for what is going on in the geopolitical realm. And that is why there is so much political anger, so much violence connected to the Temple Mount, and it will only increase as we draw closer to the end, because again, that is the spiritual end game for all the marbles. It is where God has placed his name, his Har Moed, his Mount of Assembly, which is where the final battle will be fought. We're living in prophetic times, the most prophetic times since the first century, and what a time to be alive. The new books, The Copper Scroll Project, The Rabbi, The Secret Message and the Identity of Messiah, and The Rabbi's Donald Trump and the Top Secret Plan to Build the Third Temple, with Tom Horn, Pastor Carl Gallups, and Shelley Neese. I'm Derek Gilbert. We thank you for watching as we keep watch. This is Skywatch TV.
Millions of people from around the globe were stunned when U.S. President Donald Trump shocked the world by recognizing Jerusalem as the eternal capital of Israel and ordering the American embassy to be moved there.
The United States finally and officially recognized Jerusalem as the true capital of Israel and opened our embassy in the historic and sacred land of Jerusalem.
Over 2,000 years have elapsed since Jesus Christ warned of a day when a man of sin, the Antichrist, would appear to lead the world into deception and destruction.
Even Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu admits that biblical prophecies are unfolding, that Donald Trump is a King Cyrus-like figure leading the world into a new era of man.
President Trump, by recognizing history, you have made history. The Temple Mount is in our hands.
Violent protests continued in the Middle East today over President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital.
And now the official Sanhedrin in Israel declare President Trump is advancing a prophetic process that will usher in, when the time comes, the rebuilding of the Third Temple.
As the world awaits, a secret, incendiary scheme is underway by religious authorities, government agents, and Jewish rabbis to build a third temple.
When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in that holy place, then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be again.
The rabbis, Donald Trump, and the top secret plan to build the third temple.
The geopolitics around the Temple Mount sometimes reads like the script of a made-for-television docudrama or teleplay. Welcome to Skywatch TV. I'm Derek Gilbert. We're going to be talking about this in this web-exclusive broadcast with the authors of a couple of new books that we are proud to offer. Because, again, the drama behind these stories are like something that would come out of Hollywood. First, the best-selling author of Gods of Ground Zero, Gods and Thrones, and The Rabbi Who Found Messiah. His brand new book is The Rabbi, The Secret Message and the Identity of Messiah. We welcome back to the program Pastor Carl Gallups.
Thank you, Derek. It's good to be here.
And again, I hate to overuse this analogy, but it sounds like something that you'd see as a cable special. It reminds me of that series Dig on the USA Network a little while back. The Copper Scroll Project. We welcome back to the program Shelley Neese. Shelley,
Thanks for having me.
That's what came to mind when I first started reading about the Copper Scroll and the project and the dig at Qumran and what the Copper Scroll may be leading to. Was that the Jason Isaacs series that was on USA Network a couple of years ago, Dig, because you got all of these things. You got the supernatural element in here. You got this hidden secrets that groups are trying to prevent from being found. For people who haven't read the book yet, let's give some background. What is the Copper Scroll and why is there so much interest around it?
Sure. Where the Copper Scroll is part of the Dead Sea Scroll collection. So as all of the rest of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's dated to sometime in the 1st century. It was found in one of the caves around Qumran. And I want to just say, I think part of the thing, when this evokes so much in the imagination, I mean, when we think about the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail, the Philosopher's Stone, whatever these things are, there are certain pieces of antiquity that have just arrested the human imagination forever, that we've never been able to forget about. When the prophet Jeremiah says that one day there will come a day when these things are forgotten, well, they're not forgotten now. And so, and the Ark being primary in that list. But I think, too, I see it happen in people that some hope is aroused whenever they hear about the Copper Scroll, and that there might still be hope of reconnecting to the temple and to Jewish history and to the beginnings of Christian history as well. And that's what the Copper Scroll does. It shines just a lot of light on that time period in the 1st century when Christianity was just being birthed. I mean, the Dead Sea Scrolls aren't Christian documents, they're Jewish documents, but still Christianity was right there in the womb. And Rabbinic Judaism, as we know it today, really birthed during this historical period. So to me, as Christians, we can't really know too much or study too much or dive in too deep into that time period in our history and in our faith walks to know where it all came from, where it all started, what the Messiah was fulfilling, what was the political temperature of Jerusalem, and what was Roman occupation like. And I feel like this document shines a lot of light on that. But it is a 2,000-year-old treasure map. It's not going to shine light on that because of the narrative that it gives, but it will by virtue of that. This is a 2,000-year-old treasure map that something was pressing, something was happening. The Romans were knocking at the gate, or if it's older, the Babylonians were knocking at the gate. And there was a desperation to hide holy relics that were associated with the Jewish temple, and they wrote it on a scroll made of copper and hid it in a cave around Qumran.
So now, do we know who wrote it? I mean, with some of the documents, for example, at the ancient Amorite kingdom of Ugarit, which dates to about the time of the Judges. So we're going back to like 1200 BC now, 1200 years earlier than the Copper Scroll. Some of those texts actually are signed by the scribe who wrote the document. This was written by Ili Milku, the scribe of da-da-da-da. And do we know who wrote the Copper Scroll and when?
No, so we don't. We can try and study a little bit the origins of the Copper Scroll just by looking to other oral histories about covert temple rescue operations. But no, there's no clear signature. I love that, Derek, you are the smartest host that I've ever.
I told you.
This is impressive.
I warned you.
As you were going down that lane, I thought, oh, he's going there. I love it. So no, so there's no signature on the Copper Scroll. There's no indication like the other Dead Sea Scrolls. They'll say that they were written by Baruch or Jeremiah or, claim some really famous authorship. However, even more interestingly, the Copper Scroll is written almost in a childish handwriting. It wouldn't have been, it's not papyrus, it's not leather, so it wouldn't have been written in a traditional way. It was chiseled. So they had several different styluses, and they would hammer it out onto the copper. And but it's very poor penmanship, which to me makes it more interesting. One theory is that it was written by an illiterate person, because when the priests were giving them where these burial locations are, they didn't want them to be able to go back and find it. And so there's 60 grammatical mistakes in the Copper Scroll.
Oh, wow.
There's points where the words get squished together because you can tell that, unlike a professional scribe, they realize that they're starting to run out of room. And then at the very end, the handwriting is clearly very rushed, as if, they're at the gates.
Yeah.
Time is of the essence. And so to me, the actual handwriting of the Copper Scroll, even though it doesn't tell us exactly who wrote it, it tells us something about the pressing nature of how it was written, and that it was multiple authors, and that these were not professionals. They were doing this as a note to themselves, possibly thinking that they could recover these items in the future.
Wow.
Now, Carl, we get almost the same sense of...
Can we talk more about this?
Well, sure.
No, I'm kidding. It's just so fascinating.
It is fascinating, but I want to bring this together with
it does come
the
together.
detective work that went into the Rabbi Kaduri story. Who was the revered Orthodox rabbi who left these clues behind that were to be opened a year after his passing. That he had found that Messiah had been revealed to him.
Right.
Again, I guess if there's a theme to this program, it's this. It's almost, the sense that there's if you were to write this as a script, that there would be a drama here.
Yes.
This could be dramatized into a really compelling story, and that's what kind of comes through in the Rabbi, the Secret Message, and the Identity of Messiah. So, again, what is some of the intrigue involved with Rabbi Kaduri, diving a little deeper into the story than we did in the broadcast program?
Right.
The efforts to conceal or maybe debunk or deny or obfuscate the actual revelation.
Right. Yeah, I, as you know, and as you said earlier, I am the author of the first and really only scholarly work that was published by a major publisher and put out before the world when it all unfolded, and it's called The Rabbi That Found Messiah, the story of Yitzhak Kaduri. Now, this book is a follow-up to that some years later, because so much more has happened, as you just alluded to. There are backstories, other people are involved in the story now, major players, connections. Messianic Rabbi Zev Porat, born and raised in Israel, lives in Tel Aviv, has this huge Messianic ministry, but his whole family deeply involved in the religious and political world of Israel. He speaks Hebrew as his first language. His father was a very famous, important rabbi that worked in the United States and Israel back and forth with schools and synagogues. And so Zev came with him. He learned English. He has almost an American accent because of that. But in the meantime, his grandfather was a rabbi. His great-grandfather was a rabbi. They were Dayans, judges in the rabbinical courts. On his mother's side, most of them connected deeply into the Israeli government, very high political positions. So this is who Messianic Rabbi Zev Porat is, but he was directly connected to Kaduri and Ariel Sharon. Ariel Sharon was the prime minister at the time Kaduri died. They both died in the same month, just weeks apart. Shockingly, a few months before, Ariel Sharon didn't die. He went into a coma where he would later die from it. But it all happened in the same month. Ariel Sharon went into a coma of January 2006. A couple of weeks later, Rabbi Yitzhak Kaduri went into the hospital with severe pneumonia, passed away January 2006. But just a few months before that, Rabbi Kaduri said, look, he's to his synagogue congregation, and I've got all this documented in this book and the previous book, but he said, I've had a revelation from the Messiah, a vision. I know who he is. I know his name. He is coming soon, but he will not come until after the death of Ariel Sharon. Now, at the time he said that, Ariel Sharon was the prime minister and as healthy as a horse, everybody thought. Within weeks of him saying that, Ariel Sharon suffers what would later kill him, a stroke, and put him in a coma that he was in for 8 years.
Was it 8 years?
Yeah, right at 8 years. Yeah, and so when he died in 2014, so it was 8 years. He went into the coma in 2006. But just a few weeks after that, Kaduri gets sick, goes in the same hospital. Of course, by then they had moved him, but went to the same hospital. Within a few weeks, he died in January. But he told his congregation, he said, Messiah won't come until after Ariel Sharon has died. Now, so people say, well, what's all that about? Was he setting dates? No, I think it's a biblical marker. You know, you can go to the book of Daniel. It talks about how many sevens until the coming of the Messiah. Cyrus, the building of the temple, it'll be so many things until the temple is built. There are markers in the Bible. God uses time markers without setting dates, but he will say these things will happen and these things will happen. All of Matthew 24, you know, before the Lord returns, you will see this and this, and wars and rumors of wars, and the abomination that causes desolation, and false Christ and many Christ, you'll be turned over to kings. And then, the end will come. So it's the same kind of thing that happened when he speaks this and says, Ariel Sharon. Well, Messianic Rabbi Zev Porat, Ariel Sharon stayed in his grandmother's house. She was connected to the family. Rabbi Kaduri was good friends of Zev Porat's, I think it was his great-grandfather or either grandfather. Rabbi Kaduri's name was mentioned in Zev's home all the time he was a kid. Well, in the meantime, Zev, as he gets into his adult years, it's a long story, but it's in there. It's his testimony that's amazing. But he has this revelation of Jesus being the Christ. He gives his life to Christ. His family disowns him, totally disowns him. In fact, he had a $40 million inheritance that the attorneys called him in to sign a piece of paper from his grandfather. Between property and cash, it was $40 million left to Zev, but he had to denounce Jesus Christ in writing because his grandfather was furious with him, and Zev wouldn't do it.
Wow.
And even the attorney said, look, just sign it and denounce. And then a year from now, you can just say, I changed my mind and there's nothing they can do. He says, I will not put my name on a piece of paper that says I denounce Jesus Christ. He said, I will not do that. He turned down $40 million. Now, I'm saying all of that because all of this is in this book, plus all of the connections, Ariel Sharon to his family, Kaduri to his family. He's connected to the students of Kaduri. So all of the things that I wrote about from a journalistic, scholarly standpoint years ago, now has put so much flesh on it, so much human flesh, human emotions, supernatural backstories that I can now tell. Witnesses that came forward from the writing of the first book that have shared things with me that I've been able to confirm and I can now tell. My supernatural connection to Zev Parat and this whole story, and then what God has done in his life and my life and our lives together since then in this story, the persecution he's taken, the persecution I've taken, but the story keeps bubbling up before the world. It's connected to the possibility of a third temple and the Temple Mount. It's all connected to that. It's connected to the most prophetic times that we're living in, the unsealing that Daniel was told of the last day, seal it up. I mean, this has happened, the Copper Scroll, the Rabbi vision, Rabbi Kaduri vision. It's an amazing, amazing story that goes back about a dozen years, but it's just continuing to bloom right before our eyes. And listen, the Orthodox, the deeply Orthodox in Israel know it, and they're terrified of it. There is a deep state in Israel. There is a fake news industry in Israel. It is working day and night. It is working overtime to bury this story. They cannot do it. It's bigger than life. It's bigger than them. And then again, we have an ambassador by the name of Messianic Rabbi Zev Parat that lives right in the midst of it, who's telling it, preaching it, teaching it, ministering to disciples of Kaduri's who are now born again, Jesus-believing Christians who are testifying. Some of them have had to move from their homes and hometowns because of the persecution. The book covers all of that. This book, the first book, was kind of a more journalistic, scholarly presentation. This one is scholarly and is journalistic, but it reads more like yours, more like a story, a movie. In fact, Zev Parat, he gave me all of his material, and I had it all. I wrote it and then had it all approved by him, etc. I put it together, and I sent him the manuscript. He read it. He says, "My gosh, Carl," I said, This is like watching a movie. It's like watching a movie. I could see a movie on my phone. So this book's written differently. It's written in more of a narrative style, a biographical style, but it pulls in so much cool stuff that's happened since then.
Well, you mentioned the third temple and the intrigues around the Temple Mount.
Yes.
And Shelley, that's where we come back to the archaeology behind the Copper Scroll and the Qumran caves and the archaeological efforts like the Temple Mount Sifting Project, where they're going through the rubble that had been moved by the Waqf and Muslims digging underneath the Temple Mount to try to find artifacts. And they found some really cool things there, dated to the time of Hezekiah and so forth.
Right.
Again, I keep coming back to this series a few years back, and I wish they'd done a second season because it was really cool. But the elements, I think, are similar. What is it about the archaeology in Israel and the potential there for conflict that archaeologists run into when they're digging?
Absolutely. Well, I think so much ancient Israel and all of ancient Israel's dilemmas is just forever tethered to modern Israel, and those dilemmas and those where Israel finds herself in the world and what she has to defend is not dissimilar between the last 2,000 years. But I think that ancient Israel and biblical Israel has a way of bubbling up at major moments in modern Israel's history. So you look at, Israel is being rebirthed in 1948, and that's when the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls come to the market.
Right.
1967, Israel attains Jerusalem. It gets the Temple Mount back, but also part of that military operation was getting the Rockefeller Museum, which is where all of the Dead Sea Scrolls were housed. There wasn't a single Jewish person allowed to be on the editorial team from 1948 to 1967.
Really?
And studying the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were controlled by the Jordanian Department of Antiquities. So as Israel is acquiring the Temple Mount, as they're, knocking at Lion's Gate, they have archaeologists in tanks that are securing the Dead Sea Scrolls at the Rockefeller Museum.
Wow.
They came for the Dead Sea Scrolls. So 1948, 1967, and now at this point with the U.S. Embassy moving to Jerusalem and more international recognition of Jerusalem, I just always see that some part of Israel's past always has a way of bubbling up right now in Israel's national history that we're witnessing right now. The Kaduri testimony plays into that, and what I see happening on the Temple Mount now that the Copper Scroll Project connects to, but also archaeology in general, is that there is a change in temperature on the Temple Mount. We're in new waters now. Forever the status quo has been Jews as an oppressed people for 2,000 years. We're just grateful to get the Western Wall back. The Western Wall is the retaining wall for what was holy.
It was not actually part of a temple building.
Right.
Yeah.
But when you are an oppressed people that have been oppressed for 2,000 years, you are grateful for the peace that you can get back.
Right.
And so it's taken all of this time for Israelis to start talking in coffee shops and secular Israelis to start rethinking, wait, why aren't we going up on the Temple Mount? Isn't the Temple Mount the holy place? You know, there's been some conflict about whether or not Jews are allowed to walk around the Temple Mount. Will they be crossing over the Holy of Holies? But now archaeology has shown all that as well. We know where the Holy of Holies was. We know if Jewish people need to avoid it, how they should avoid it, and what to walk around. The Temple Mount is huge. So I just think that all of this is pressing up to a moment that Israel's ancient past is revealing her future. And every time that Israelis, secular Israelis, regular Israelis get a hold of that, they remember who they are. So for me, if the Copper Scroll Project can find even one piece of temple vessels, of ritual temple vessels, that is Israel's dowry. That is reminding her of the covenant and the relationship that she has entered into with God. And I just want to play a part in giving that back.
Yeah, that's beautiful. You know,
Fascinating stuff.
You and I've talked about this before. And we are now living in the most prophetic time since the first coming of Jesus Christ. I mean, a 2,700-year-old prophecy is sitting there in the land. Israel is back. Another 2,700-year-old prophecy. Jerusalem is now the center of it again. I mean, the Middle East has exploded. Syria has collapsed into an irreconcilable civil war. Russia's in the Middle East with its military. China has built in Djibouti on the Horn of Africa, supplying troops to Russia in the Middle East, in Syria. Turkey's collapsing into an resurrected Ottoman Empire. Iran is connected to Russia. I mean, Ezekiel 38 is coming to life before our eyes. Borders of the Western nations in Europe and in the United States are collapsing or on the verge of collapsing. I mean, I could go on and on and on. And now the Copper Scroll is being opened before the world. The whole Kaduri revelation is being opened twice before the world, once right after it happened, and now I mean, it is just all coming together like this. It's like what God told Daniel, the angel told Daniel. He says, look, I've shown you the end of times. And Daniel saw it. He talked about the Great Tribulation, even talked about what seems to be the rapture somewhere in there. He talked about the God's people being lifted up, protected, taken care of in those days. But he said, but seal this up until the time of the end. That word until is important. It means it will be unsealed. But there's a time when everything's going to begin to converge. And people all over the world, even people that don't know the scriptures, even people that don't know what we know and understand, they're saying what's going on? What's happening? This world is coming apart at the seams. Something huge is getting ready to happen. And there is this feeling all over the world that something deeply spiritual is at the brink of snapping and popping. These are the times that we're living in. We've been raised up for such a time as this.
And not just fear, but hope.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, those two things sort of, I've heard the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., where I live, they talk about when they built that museum, one of the things that they thought that people would walk away, and they give these surveys afterwards, that when people walk away, they'll think, you know, oh, I've reconnected with the Bible, or I believe in the historicity of the Bible, or the lands of the Bible, that they would come away with some teaching tool from one of those things. But what they never expected was that almost every single person, when they fill out the story of how did this place impact you, every single one, the majority answer is, it gave me hope. So within all of that, messianic hope is our ideal. So when we talk about the end times, when we talk about all of this approaching, it's all also interlaid with this hope and the messianic hope that's, you know, inherited that we've inherited from the Jews, and that we want to just bring them all of this into this together, that we've all been grafted in together.
And we're ambassadors of the kingdom. And Jesus even taught us to pray, thy kingdom come, Lord. Come. Thy will be done one day on earth as it is in heaven. And so that's it. We see the times. We're very privileged to be in these times. It's like Peter wrote and Paul wrote when it finally hit them as they're writing these documents. Oh my gosh, We were the ones that God raised up to see the coming of the Christ. We witnessed the resurrection. Peter says we were eyewitnesses. John says we were eyewitnesses of his transfiguration. We were eyewitnesses of the resurrection. Paul says, who are we to experience this? Who am I? Who am I that we would live in this time? Paul speaks in Romans, we were predestined or selected for this time. He said, this is unbelievable. Peter screams at the church in his writing, say, don't you know who we are? Don't you see what we've just lived through? And we can kind of say the same thing because we're on the other side of the birth of Israel. 70 years. And all the things I just said, I won't repeat them, are coming together like this. And you're right. So I'm honored. I feel privileged. I'm excited to live in these times. I don't set dates. I don't walk around wringing my hands. Oh, it's the end of the world. Well, good. It's the end of man's rule and reign and the beginning of Jesus Christ.
Bring the kingdom.
right.
Bring it. Even so, Lord Jesus, come.
Amen.
But in the meantime, we're living in our day. We've been raised up for such a time as this. We are to be the salt, the light, the ambassadors, and this is an exciting time in which to live and minister.
Amen to that. I want to tell you how to get these new books by Carl Gallups and Shelley Neese, as well as the new book by Tom Horn, The Copper Scroll Project, The Rabbi, The Secret Message and the Identity of Messiah, The Rabbis, Donald Trump, and the Top Secret Plan to Build the Third Temple. We'll tell you about that, and we'll come back. I want to find out how this Kaduri revival in Jerusalem, in Israel, is helping to inspire more excitement about the Third Temple. That's ahead on Skywatch TV. Welcome back to Skywatch TV. I'm Derek Gilbert. Joining me for this web-exclusive broadcast, again available through Apple TV, Roku, and the free Skywatch TV mobile app. And if you haven't downloaded it yet, why haven't you? You'll find the link at skywatchtv.com. Author Shelley Neese, the new book, The Copper Scroll Project, and Pastor Carl Gallups' new book, The Rabbi, The Secret Message and the Identity of Messiah. Carl, the revelation by Rabbi Kaduri,
Yes.
that the identity of Messiah had been revealed to him. How is this impacting religious Jews, and how is this fitting into excitement about the possibility of a third temple?
Well, okay. I could tell that in an hour. I'm going in my mind figuring out how to tell this in 2 or 3 minutes block here. But
The Reader's Digest
Yes,
version
I know. Really, that's the hardest
we
part.
want to leave reason for people to buy and read the book.
That's the hardest part of writing a 300-page book and then
Right.
and then giving a 2-minute explanation of
Especially when you're a Baptist preacher.
it. Especially when you're about this preacher, right? Yeah.
Not a gift.
No, it's not. But no, the bottom line is this. Look, I'm very honest about this in the book. I'll be honest about it in the interview. There's a large part of the Orthodox religious segment of Judaism that rejects this revelation, this story.
Sure.
They would say it's false, it's made up, it's a Christian trick. Well,
it would be a bitter pill to swallow.
It would be a bitter pill to swallow, but I gently rebuff all of that. I mean, I show the documented truth of this. You know, I spent many years in law enforcement before being in the ministry, some of that doing my own criminal investigations and being involved in criminal investigations directly. So a lot of my writing about these kinds of things kind of comes from a cop investigator, plus a theologian and a student of God's Word and the languages. And so it's written in such a way that rebuffs the attacks from that segment. But on the other hand, connected to that is with Zev Porat over there, who's lived it, connected to all of this. The revelation, he knew about it before I did. In fact, I talk about him in my first book, and I hadn't even met him then. I just knew that he knew about all this. So now that it's coming alive, a dozen years later, it's just blooming before our eyes. What's happening now is Jews in Israel are being saved. Orthodox Jews, rabbis are coming to Christ. And listen, I tell the stories in the book. I wish I had time. A couple of Muslim imams who were introduced to this, listened to it, very fascinated, asked a lot of questions, and then sometime later called Zev and said, I've had a vision. I've had a dream of Jesus. I've denounced Islam. I'm having to move. I'm having to hide from family and friends. I mean, it's just the book tells all this.
Wow.
Oh yes. He went right into a Muslim mosque in the leading of God. Zev did, and went right up to the imam. And the imam said, "What are you doing here? You're a Jew. What are you doing?" He says, "God has sent me." With a message. And so Zev starts telling him about everything. And it's absolutely astounding. There are now discipleship rooms, secret discipleship rooms in Israel in several places where Orthodox Jews will come into those places because they revere Kaduri, but this story's getting out more and more, and they're seeing the evidence, and they're saying, oh my gosh, if our leader of Orthodoxy says that Jesus is Messiah and is right here in his own handwriting, we've got to check this out. So they're going to these rooms. Rabbis are sneaking in, coming to these rooms. I don't expose where these rooms are, but I talk about them, and Zev backs it up. He said, oh, yes, I'm involved in some of that, and some of my best friends are involved in this. I know what I'm talking about. So the statistics are that there are some 14, 15, 16,000 Messianic Jews living in Israel. Zev says, oh, no, Carl. This is my home. He says, there are more like 30 to 40 to 50,000. He says, so many of them. He says, I talk to them. They'll tell me, I've been a believer in Yeshua for years, but I can't tell anybody. I'll lose everything. I'll lose my job. My family will disown me. Zev's had that happen to him. But he says that he meets and speaks to these people all the time, day in, day out. He's in the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Haifa and these places all the time, ministering. So anyway, all of that is told. So the bottom line is, that's what's happening. It's bubbling up. It's boiling over. The anti-missionary movements, Orthodox movements, they can't stand it. They're upset about it. In the meantime, Kaduri said some things about the temple in the last days, but that was before he died. Jerusalem had not been handed back to Israel. There was no way a temple is going to be built, but now everybody's talking about the possibility. So Kaduri's connected even to that temple furor. He's connected to being the most venerated Orthodox rabbi in Israel's modern history, yet he, on his deathbed note, leaves a note saying Yeshua is the real Messiah. That breaks open this whole witnessing opportunity. Jews are being saved. That book, the first book I wrote, was taken into the underground churches in China. Revivals are taking place there over this whole thing. It's huge. The story's huge, not necessarily my writing, but the story is huge. And it's connected. Copper Scroll, what's happened with Donald Trump and the Third Temple that Brother Tom has written about. It's all connecting and joining together.
So you're actually seeing revival in China from this book?
Yes,
too.
and in Israel. And in Israel. Believers. It's tough, though. What a lot of people don't know, and you've lived in Israel, and you know this, that if you are a true Orthodox Jew, and you come home and tell your family that you're now a believer in Jesus Christ, it's tough. I mean, some people lose everything, the venom, the angst, the anxiety.
The enemy's done a really good job over the last 2 millennia of driving that wedge between.
And Jesus said it. He said, your mother, father, sisters, brothers will turn against you. You know, this is going to happen. And it did. And so anyway, it's quite a story. I mean, it's huge. And I think it's very prophetically connected.
Now, Shelley, I guess we'll just kind of move towards a conclusion here on this program, but what is the status now of the Copper Scroll project? What would have to happen next for there to be actual excavations to try to find some of these treasures that the scroll seems to point to?
Right. Well, Qumran is technically Area C of Israel, so that's Judea, Samaria, that's disputed territory.
West Bank.
Right.
Yeah.
It's the West Bank. And so anytime excavations happen in the West Bank, they're technically not part of the Israel Antiquities Authority. They are part of the ADCA, which is Israel's pretty much their military administration of the archaeological department in that area. So they're not as transparent as the Israel Antiquities Authority when they're, for good reason. I mean, every time that they find something, it will be a protested object according to the Israel Antiquity or the international antiquities laws. Anything that comes out of the ground, not just in Qumran, but anywhere in the West Bank. And by the way, you know, Judea, Samaria is really the core of all of the biblical stories that we know and love. So they're chock full. I mean, there's thousands of digs going on.
Well, I know that surprised me. We talked after we got back in May this year with a pastor of a very large ministry, and we told him we had gone to Bethel and Shiloh. And I know at Shiloh there's a dig where a Christian archaeologist believes that they found the site where the tabernacle site.
Absolutely.
But we mentioned this pastor, and he was like, West Bank. How did you get there? I was like, well, we got a really good tour guide. But I was surprised because you're right. Those are some of the most important sites in the history of Israel.
But what's going on there is not so transparent, and for good reasons. I'm not putting the blame on Israel for that.
Sure.
It has its reasons for doing those excavations, but not advertising those excavations.
Political implications for things that they find.
Absolutely. So, and that in that way, the Indiana Jones movie isn't so inaccurate. Like, things that are found under this military civil administration in Judea, Samaria, in the West Bank, technically do go in a military warehouse. So,
okay.
So the big box with the rubber, red stamp that says Ark of the Covenant, like, that's not so not feasible. Now, when the items are really good, we eventually hear about them and they are eventually displayed. But it's not so easy. It's definitely a more complicated process. All that to say, when we do start digging, you probably won't hear about it for a while.
Okay.
But that there are still surveys, there are still things being done. The Dead Sea, any Israeli archaeologists, they tell me, you stick a shovel in the area around the Dead Sea and it's always worth it. So we're saying, hey, dig here at this exact GPS coordinate, and we've had a positive scan for it. But the truth is that it's worth it to stick a shovel almost anywhere in that area because it's still proving to be that surveys are yielding finds. There was 2 years ago, archaeologist Oren Gutfeld, which is someone that's also involved with the Copper Scroll Project in terms of that he's in the book, and he's someone that I follow his career a lot. And he's had a great year, and he found that there was actually 12 Dead Sea Scroll caves, and we had only thought that there was 11. And so, so this process of surveying, we just want to swoop under that. And whether or not we've learned the hard way through the Copper Scroll Project, Jim Barfield has learned the hard way that the less it's advertised, the faster it works. So you'll hear about it when there's a find.
So now, again, the political implications here, I guess just one final question for both of you. Where does it go from here? I mean, the Temple Mount, obviously, protests involved anytime Jews want to get access to the Temple Mount. What happens next? I mean, if you had to guess over the next few years, where do things go from here?
So I'll go first.
Yeah, please. No, please.
Because I have something that comes to my mind almost immediately. But where I just see the most positive movement is that Jews and Christians are coming together on this issue of the Temple Mount. Third Temple being set aside, there is still a real lack of human rights on the Temple Mount. So whether or not there is a place of religious worship for Jews and Christians on the Temple Mount, they don't have the right to pray on top of the Temple Mount. So right now, only Muslims can pray on top of the Temple Mount. And if you are a Jewish person that looks like you're mumbling the words to a Psalms, you can be arrested and taken off the Temple Mount. So to me, that is the first step. That is like achieving real religious human rights for Jews and Christians on the Temple Mount is the first step. And some of my more religious Jewish friends call it like that we are going to change the landscape on the Temple Mount. Have more Jews and more Christians visiting the Temple Mount, going there for bar mitzvahs, going there before your wedding, making this the place that it is, which is the holiest place in Judaism. And so I see Christians and religious Jews coming together in that alliance and that, this next fight for this next, until we've achieved that, anything else seems very far off from even the realm of possibility. So, and that's been a really beautiful thing to me. And that's happened with the Copper Scroll Project, really just who has become allies to achieve this freedom and this right, which really, it's usually mostly cloaked in the language of human rights. It's something that's hard to fight against. Like, why should we not be allowed to pray and worship in this place that is sacred to us all? And so to me, like, that's the first line of defense, and it's something that requires Jews and Christians coming together and fighting for.
Sure. Well, Carl, as a political observer as well as a student of Bible prophecy, where do you see things going here in the next
Well, I
years?
agree with everything that Shelley just said, and I truly do. And also, I'd like to add another teachable moment here concerning the scriptures and history and how it all ties together, and that is this. I don't know, listen, there are 4 or 5 different veins of eschatology concerning the temple. Is it before the Antichrist, after the Antichrist? Will it house the Antichrist? Will it not house? Will it be before Jesus returns, or will the temple be built only after Jesus? You've got all these schools of thoughts. Even among the Jews, there are different denominations of thought. Some of the Jews don't want a temple up there at all. They say, no, we don't need that. Other Jews say it's imperative that we have a temple for our Messiah to come. So, you're going to ask Carl, well, what's going to happen? Well, I didn't have an angelic visit last night that told me exactly. But here's what I'm saying. Here's the teachable moment. Just like there are many people, Jews and Christians, who are saying it's impossible for the temple ever to be built up there on the Temple Mount. Well, here's the truth of that matter. Nothing is impossible with God. If He is going to bring it about, it will happen. Way back, when God spoke thousands of years ago that Israel would return, you go back and read the classic commentators, those 100, 200 years ago, the vast majority of them, not all of them, but some of them saw it, but the vast majority said, well, we don't understand these prophecies about the return of Israel. That's impossible. In other words, in human terms, it's impossible. The politics won't allow it. The region won't. There's no. The Jews are scattered. I mean, couple hundred years ago, they're all over. They don't even speak Hebrew anymore. They're in all the different lands and customs, and we don't even know. And that land back then, of course, Palestinian Authority, UN. Well, it belonged to Great Britain and the French, and so they were saying it won't work. It's impossible. It's impossible. But God spoke it. And when you read the scriptures, it appears to be literal. And so what a lot of those scholars would say is, well, that's going to happen. That can only happen when Jesus comes. Okay, so when He comes, that's when Israel will return. But in the meantime, it's impossible. But God spoke it, and it kept that prophecy, His word, move forward, move down through the generations. Our little 60, 70, 80 years of life, we're just here for a blip, and we're gone. And then there's another generation, and they're gone. But in the middle of those generations, God's word's going forward. And Israel was born. And Jerusalem has been returned. Now, I don't know. Will a temple be put on the Temple Mount? Well, sometime, somewhere, somehow, it surely appears in the scriptures that's going to be. Just like setting the date for the rapture, I don't set the exact date and terms for the building of a temple on the Temple Mount. But I know that the Orthodox Jews want it, require it, need it, look for it, planning for it, the Temple Institute and everything else. So it wouldn't surprise me to see now that everything has happened geopolitically that has happened just recently, wouldn't surprise me at all to see this great effort moving toward. But here's the point. So it's all moving forward. Don't call something impossible that God has declared will happen one day somehow, just like Israel returned, just like the Messiah coming, born in a manger. I mean, all that was in the scriptures for hundreds of years, but it moved right through the generations until, boom, there it was. And shepherds saw it, and wise men saw it. You understand? Then it would be 30 years later before he'd even go to a cross. You don't hear about the shepherds or the wise men being there. They probably were dead. They probably were in their 40s or 50s back when the birth, and now they're gone. But they moved through, but it happened anyway. The cross happened. The resurrection happened. The ascension happened. You understand? The birth of the church happened, just like the scripture said. So now we're in the time on the other side of all of that, on the other side of Jerusalem, Israel, 70 years, the other side of Jerusalem, just a year or less. And now all this talk about Temple Mount, Kaduri's message getting bigger and bigger, Jews being saved, the Copper Scroll, being uncovered, people examining it, excavations, people going, oh my gosh, this could be some of the stuff from the temple. It could be the Ark of the Covenant itself. All of this stuff is just coming together. So huge political implications, huge geopolitical implications, huge theological implications. But I tell God's people, look, God's word has always proven itself to be true. Let's don't do like the Pharisees. They had Jesus standing right in front of them and they missed him because he didn't fit in their box of interpretation. And so I say, let's explore, let's talk, let's give our opinions. You can even be passionate about what you think, how it might unfold, but don't put everything in a tight little box and say, this is it. If you don't believe this, you're wrong. Because that's in the name
That's always what gets you on the wrong side of history.
In the name of God, outside the temple of God, they crucified the Son of God and thought they were doing God a favor. So I'm just looking at all of this saying, wow, I don't know the date or the time unless God reveals it to me, but I see it moving to this hugely prophetic pinpoint, and all of this is tying together, and I am thrilled to live in these days. I sometimes I just think about who I used to be, who I am, what I'm doing, and how in the world did I get caught up in all of this? It's amazing. Praise be unto the Lord.
We're all called to be watchmen on the wall.
Yes.
I mean, if anything, we don't know. We're just to prayerfully approach it and to be
That's it.
watchmen, to watch
That's
it
right.
play out.
And God will honor it, and He will
Amen.
use us along the way.
Yeah, amazing times to be alive.
Yes.
And we're happy that you're here with us and just trying to observe, report, and analyze to the best of our ability. The new books by Shelley Neese, The Copper Scroll Project, Pastor Carl Gallup's The Rabbi, Secret Message, and the Identity of Messiah. And, of course, the new book by Tom Horn as well, The Rabbis, Donald Trump, and the Top Secret Plan to Build the Third Temple. Again, we are blessed to be living in interesting times,
Yes, we
to
are.
paraphrase the old Chinese
Yes, we are.
proverb. And we thank you for watching as we keep watch. I'm Derek Gilbert. This is Skywatch TV.
Millions of people from around the globe were stunned when U.S. President Donald Trump shocked the world by recognizing Jerusalem as the eternal capital of Israel and ordering the American embassy to be moved there.
The United States finally and officially recognized Jerusalem as the true capital of Israel and opened our embassy in the historic and sacred land of Jerusalem.
Over 2,000 years have elapsed since Jesus Christ warned of a day when a man of sin, the Antichrist, would appear to lead the world into deception and destruction.
Even Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu admits that biblical prophecies are unfolding, that Donald Trump is a King Cyrus-like figure leading the world into a new era of man.
President Trump, by recognizing history, you have made history. The Temple Mount is in our hands.
Violent protests continued in the Middle East today over President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital.
And now the official Sanhedrin in Israel declare President Trump is advancing a prophetic process that will usher in, when the time comes, the rebuilding of the Third Temple.
As the world awaits, a secret, incendiary scheme is underway by religious authorities, government agents, and Jewish rabbis to build a third temple.
When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in that holy place, then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be again.
The rabbis, Donald Trump, and the top secret plan to build the third temple.